Do I need to refresh?
All right, okay, I think we're finally live. We went live a few seconds ago and did an intro, and we weren't live, so
It's mine's not showing
it's
live.
live. It'll just
Let's
be a
wait.
little, there'll be latency. So in terms of seeing things, just understand that you're probably going to be um, maybe a minute or so behind. All right, welcome everybody to session number 4 of Sapionite and Stereopandemonia study sessions, research sessions, whatever we Q&As, whatever we want to do. It's St. Patrick's Day today, so we thought we would do uh, a little showcase of the Irish Pantheon or Gaelic Pantheon poster that I made a while back now. A little bit of change of form, but also these sessions are meant to be an open conversation. That's why I have with me here Callie of Studio Pandemonia. I partner in business, in crime, and all these things. And she has kind of a druidic background, so that's going to be relevant here. But this is going to be kind of an open conversation, and we can take questions. We have people in the chat here on our server who can ask questions too when we ask for questions, and that's okay. And we will provide a link in the comments for anyone to come in so they can join the server where we talk about and work through paganism, neo-paganism, mythology, practice, making the world a better place, that kind of stuff. No big deal. If you're interested in that kind of thing, feel free to join in. We will ask that you are patient and ask questions when we're asking for them, or leave a post in the live chat saying I have a question, or like asking the question. That would help. But anyway, I'll take any question about my channel, about Pandemonia. We'll take anything. So just know these are kind of like supposed to be chill sessions where either I or we or anyone kind of just hangs out and works through some stuff. So yeah, that's my intro. Callie, do you have any?
This is our fun new experiment. We're live here in the Discord. I've got the link posted in the comments if you want to go ahead and hop in. And we'll be doing the stream. But if you have like specific questions, or you want to have a breakout room or something like that, we're testing the functionality of the Discord and facilitating more lively conversation on the YouTube stream as well. So even if you have something kind of off topic, or you want to return to a previous topic, it's totally fine if we kind of break into 2 separate groups. If you've got more specific questions for Josh or I, we're going to do this for an hour or 2, and we can split off into different topics if we start vibing and checking out on one thing in particular. But the general theme today is, as Josh said, the Celtic Pantheon, specifically Irish. Josh had prepared the family tree document and research, and we've been trying to figure out what to prioritize as far as our downloadables. We want to introduce our Gumroad. I will put the link to that as well. We are going to be handling digital products much more through that rather than Patreon or Etsy, because we think it will just provide you guys with a much more high quality product. It doesn't have the file size limitations and kind of the format
Gumroad's
limitations
cool. It's got
has been plaguing us. Yeah.
It's way better than Patreon, because Patreon requires you to have like a monthly subscription. You can't just kind of tip, and it's got all these. It's just, I don't know. It's clunky and weird. Gumroad allows us to actually provide potentially classes and services and all kinds of downloadable files and various levels, and it's nicely organized. It's just nice. So that's the first link, I think, down in the comments.
It's much more egalitarian. We want to provide as much value as possible. We want people to have the freedom to kind of pick and choose what's valuable to them. We don't want to put together some kind of monthly subscription box and go here, throw away $15 a month. Like, we don't want to waste anybody's time or money. So Gumroad, several of the larger files have options to kind of pay what you want. It's got like kind of a minimum suggestion, but then if you want to tip on top of that, we're trying to be as accessible. We never want money to be the reason that you're not able to make use of the educational content. Like, we're here to do the research. We're already going to be doing it. We want everyone to have access. So we don't want that to ever be the reason if somebody's having a rough month or whatever. So we're going to try to provide as many of the options in that format as possible. And we're also kind of playing with this breadth versus depth thing as far as the kind of files we're providing. So today we have for you our very first culture guide, which actually has kind of encyclopedic entries for each of the deities that Josh introduced in the family tree. Because, of course, you know, he's made these beautiful family trees, but it's like, okay, who is that, though? So
Oh, would you like for me to
time.
open that somehow, or no?
Yeah, you should just, I'm trying to bounce between the stream and here. If you want to just figure out how to open that.
Yeah. Give me a sec.
I will give you a sec.
Yeah, seriously.
But basically, you know, we're kind of trying to straddle that line of like how much time we're spending on particular things and what we're emphasizing. So let us know. We need some feedback. If you have thoughts about this or things that you prefer or things that you'd rather see, let us know in the comments or jump in the Discord. We would love to hear your feedback and how it's actually landing for you. But the theory was like, having this visual is great, but it needs to have some explanation. So this guide is a full explanation, and drawing from my background, I did the dedicant program of ADF way back in the day. I had a much more Celtic
ADF
is Ariaphine, or a Druid Fellowship, which is kind of the American neo-pagan Druidic movement. There's also OBOD, the Order of Bards, Ovates, and Druids, which is kind of the more European organization, but kind of more recently, after COVID especially, you know, a lot of the local chapters, which are called groves, have been a bit split up. We used to have a chapter here where you could kind of go to study hour, you know, we would have open rituals and a lot of things available to the public to kind of come to, and that's unfortunately fizzled a bit, and we're having to rebuild. So I thought, oh, well, the first step, someone had approached me. We just did the convocation gathering convention here, and someone approached me talking about the Druid stuff, and like, oh, well, we were hoping to rebuild. We're starting to feel it out. You know, would you be willing to provide some insider background? I was like, oh, maybe that's a signal I should put a course together or something, or just start to at least compile the information. So this is kind of born out of that.
So this is basically what it looks like.
Yeah.
This is basically what it looks like. It's got all the entries that are in the tree, but more depth goes into it, and then there's a few practices at the end here, or some holiday information. So yeah, it's got.
Yeah, and we're trying to strike a balance too between like the kind of in-depth videos that Josh makes as far as like conveying all this information and recording that versus the other styles of videos that he's working on right now. So it's just a balancing act. So we kind of would love to hear from you if you would prefer a full video, if you prefer it in writing. You know, all of that kind of impacts our schedule and time. But we wanted to really prioritize these streams and having some Q&A time and some office hours, if you will, or some accessible time for you to ask questions. And so we're going to be doing this regularly once a week. I think we're pretty set on Sunday, Josh.
Yep. It's working out.
We're working out the kinks of the time zone. It looks like kind of around this 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock is more or less time frame.
Mm-hmm.
But that is the one thing we have fully decided is that's going to be what's regular, and we're going to try to build the topic a little around this so that there's something available for you to possibly like have or purchase or comment on and download that accompanies that. So we worked on this one this week. And it is St. Patrick's Day, so we thought the best way to celebrate would be to be as snaky as possible and do some pagan shit. So,
so the reference there, if you don't know it, is St. Patrick was said to have banished snakes from Ireland. One of his many ways of de-paganizing Ireland. And the really funny, interesting thing about that, if you look more deeply into, say, Neolithic agrarian practices is snakes were very sacred for a long time for a very practical reason. Similar to how cats are sacred, they kill vermin, and it was the Romans even had a practice. I think it was the medicine god Asclepius that unleashed serpents into every house, or like under every house, or in the basement of every house in Rome, in order to get rid of a plague, and it worked. And after that point, there was a ritual in for the Romans to have as many snakes in their house as possible, because just more was better, because they would kill off all the small rodents, and then there'd be less disease. They wouldn't get into the food supply, or all that. Same thing, same reason we have cats today. And so one thing that's really kind of funny about St. Patrick removing snakes from Ireland is there's this assumption in these kind of anti-serpentine Abrahamic religions where snake bad, and so he comes in there and says snake bad leads snake, and then what do you had? You actually had a great plague. I found a piece of the story that was kind of interesting. There was a goddess, I think it might have been Bridget or someone else, or maybe Morrigan, who was like blamed for like unleashing plague on St. Patrick for Christianizing the country. And it's like, maybe you unleash plague on yourself by killing all the snakes because they're doing a good job. Like it kind of comes with the job. So
it's not like they're cobras, okay? These are not some kind of black mamba, seriously venomous snakes. Like, they're largely benign.
Yeah, they're like gardener snakes or rat snakes, and that practice of snake veneration, and also just practical use of snakes for that sort of stuff, that goes. The Indo-Europeans, the Yamnaya and the steppe, they had a deity, Velnos, that I talked about in my Voltuna video recently. Velnos. One thing I didn't actually talk enough about this concept in that video, but it is that the snakes are used for this reason, and that's why Velnos was a guardian of stables and barns and stuff in Indo-European, because it would be against vermin. So that was one reason that they were sacred. And he came to represent that. But the Koreans also have a snake goddess, I think, that's deified. She's a rat snake. That was an interesting one. There's quite a lot.
Yeah, and just dealing with vermin in general is very important, because, of course, the rats bring the fleas that bring the bubonic plague, and are just generally kind of gross. And if you're storing large quantities of grain and you don't have refrigeration, and you don't have all of like the modern means that we have, and kind of take for granted to keep vermin under control, like, these natural methods were actually really important, because they could get out of hand really quickly and decimate your population. And we'll be talking about this in future videos, more about like the history and chronology and stuff, and like kind of the succession of plagues. But there's kind of evidence that rodents, beyond rats, that they've been actually looking into like marmots being, which are kind of like a groundhog kind of thing, kind of a more husky variant, but like them potentially carrying plague in earlier waves, kind of more in the Baltic region. And
really,
yeah, we'll have more citations and more fun stuff about that. But like in general, rodents problematic, need for control, snakes good option.
Yeah,
so
another thing that people don't. It's growing, like the scholarship is coming out on it more openly, but it's kind of taken a while for this to become a mainstream understanding. But not to say there's too many people thinking about the transition between the Neolithic and the Indo-European kind of waves of populating Europe. There's not that many people really thinking about that, so it's not like this is going to surprise them, because they don't even know what any of that is. But those who do, which is everybody who enjoys watching my channels, will probably known, or we're starting to hear about the bubonic, or not bubonic, it's the pneumonic plague that is very heavily evidenced to have happened just before the Indo-Europeans kind of spread throughout much of the world, particularly Europe. and that this plague disproportionately affected very heavily, densely populated urban centers and agrarian settlements, which were the Neolithic settlements. And the plague began, it seems, in the steppe, in the not Göbekli Tepe, obviously not, but the Cucuteni Tripilia culture. Taters, come here. You're being distracting. The cat.
Hamming it up.
But yeah, the Cucuteni Tripilia were actually a Neolithic people living right on the doorstep of the steppe in modern Ukraine, and they lived on a lot of the rivers valleys. They had some of the largest cities and the earliest cities in Europe. In fact, their cities were built massively and even bigger than the cities of Sumer at the same time. So a lot of people that say, Sumer was the first civilization. It's like, when you actually start looking at the archaeological record in the Neolithic, civilization becomes a very arbitrary word. It's like, okay, they started settling around, many people semi-settled around like 13,000. Some of them settled around caves and actually built terraces around caves, like in the Levant, for instance, around 20,000 BC. So, like, that whole wave between 20,000 BC and really civilization, which would be, like they say, like Sumer is like 3,000, 4,000 BC. It's like, that's a huge window in there where there was all kinds of settling, all kinds of large cities, all kinds of things that we might call civilizations, because they probably had some sort of central control, at least in each city. And since civilization as a definition really depends on city, it's like, oh, is this a settlement or a city? It becomes really kind of arbitrary eventually. So I'm not a big fan of civilization as a term, really. But yeah, there was a plague that hit the Cucuteni Tripilia in Ukraine, and spread out from there throughout Europe, and actually disproportionately kind of depopulated a lot of the urban places. That, combined with the Indo-Europeans being kind of warlike steppe raiders, and the wolf raid concept, the raider wolf Viking-esque concept of the warrior class there, kind of led to them spreading throughout Europe. So, interesting. Plagues are important.
Back to thinking of snakes as a civilizational technology, you do mythologically see a pretty stark, what does he want? Oh. You see a pretty stark kind of dividing line archetypally, and Josh has mentioned this a little bit before, but it's interesting to note that there's kind of a dichotomy between the snake, the pro-snake, like the snake worshipping cultures, and this kind of, usually when they're anti-serpent, they're a little bit more like bird flavored. They're kind of more pro-bird, and you see this in symbolism, like in the Aztec symbolism of like the eagle overcoming the snake, or you see it in like Indonesian mythology when you have the battle of like the Nagas and the Garudas. They're kind of like age-old, timeless enemies, which is kind of interesting when you have this very like chthonic, earth-oriented, snake medicine nature versus kind of like celestial sky, sun. And it's an interesting duality, considering that these are all kind of agrarian cultures, and they all rely very much on storage of grain and the seasonality and irrigation, all of these kind of concepts that are very civilizational. But like the snakes, the medicine, the pest reduction, the hygiene, all of those things are kind of connected, right? Because you have Asclepius being represented by the caduceus, the twin serpents, and the toxin of the snake being this kind of two-edged sword, whereas like they're both, poisonous, but they're an antidote. Snake venom in a lot of myths is also a healing agent, and they're associated with herbalism and all these things. So for the Celts, we're team snake. We're all about that life.
They did seem to have, and it's interesting when I look at the pantheon here, serpentine motifs, not actually that common in my research in Celtic. It's a bit of a blind spot, honestly. Do you know of any, Callie, like actual, like, because even Dion Keck here, right, the healer
Irish specific,
is not serpentine.
Much, like Gaulish way more, I guess, like with what I'm a little bit more
Yes, I think
familiar with.
Gaelic does have more. Yeah, you're right.
Well, there's kind of as we're working on these research projects, there's kind of the breadth depth thing, and for the sake of the family tree and being able to show kind of lineage and stuff, Josh opted to focus on kind of the Irish, which is totally cool and fine, and so we've got kind of a more complete picture.
We had Gaelic. This chart is specifically Gaelic, so that's Irish, Manx, that's the Isle of Man, and some like. I don't know why it's not coming up here. Basically, Caledonian or like pre-Scottish, Pictish, for instance. So those are Gaelic languages. Gaelic is the other word for them. They're distinct from like Welsh and Old Brythonic, which are Brythonic languages. They're kind of more in southern Britain, and they probably were there before the Gaelic languages. Some think the Gaelic language is, hey, look, there's taters right there, behind you. Some say the Gaelic languages might have actually come from Galicia in Spain and settled, and the Milesians is the story that says that, but there's multiple waves to Ireland. I am trying to kind of reconstruct what those waves were historically. I'm wondering, what were the Fomorians, for instance. So these are the Titans like Balor, Kethlin, Ethlin, Crom. These are really they have a lot of chthonic motifs. There's a lot of Balor that actually I was just looking at Talus of Minoan, the big iron guard, sun god of the island, being kind of the Titan. There's a lot of Cyclopes in the Mediterranean, like Polyphemes. There's this motif of like the Titan that guards an island or defends an island, throws rocks at boats as they come by. That's a motif that you very specifically see even in Finnish, Estonian mythology. I found it there too, and Taliesin, I think, or not Taliesin. That's a poet, but Teleavolis, I think is his name, and they're all very. It's interesting. This Titan. Cyclops, and Balor is really interesting because he like kind of represents a drought, which is when the sun is like overpowerful, and his eye represents the sun in that sense. The sun is the idea of the sun being this great eye. It's really the basis of Sauron's eye as well. That's I think directly where the evil eye evolved into with Tolkien's mythology as well. But the idea of the sun being this evil, overbearing thing, like it has a kind of. I talked last week about how I like to think of deities as having chthonic and then celestial aspects, and having good and evil sides, so to speak, light and dark sides. In this case, I see Balor as kind of like a version of Ra, a version of Lucifer, a version of Helios that has kind of gone awry or is overheated, is burning things. There's some Australian sun goddesses that like we and I'm forgetting all of their names, but there's a few sun goddesses in Australia also that are like they're considered to be cannibals, like they cook people and eat them. She's pretty ruthless at times, and it's really interesting because I think you see facets of these motifs all over the world that are slightly different, but that's one I'm just focusing on that one because I just find it really interesting. Balor is one of my favorite kind of motifs to dissect. But yeah, the Fomorians were like the first wave into Ireland, or maybe they're the second, but they might have corresponded to the Neolithic wave,
Yeah, so the bit, if you're familiar with like Greek mythology, there's the cycles of like supplanting. You've got this. You've heard of like the Gigantomachy, the Titanomachy, the Olympians, and how they're these waves. Celtic has a similar chronology, and it varies depending on which Scottish versus Irish versus Gaelic. In the contemporary practice, Druids like know the differences, but in practice, it's not. It's not typical that you would be very strict about that in the worship or the practice, or like if you attended a Druid ritual, it's implied that all Celtic is kind of welcome. and they're not really like sticklers for separating them. And there's a lot of overlap, and for the most part, with like the naming conventions, it's they go with the one with the least H's in it, as far as like how it's pronounced in public ritual. It tends to default to. So Josh gets on my case because I use a lot of the Welsh pronunciations, but I myself have studied Scottish in speaking. So I know a lot of the Irish differences, and we use a lot of the Irish deity names predominantly, so that's why that kind of won out in the family tree. But yeah, for each of the culture, they have kind of a prevalent story. There's the Mabinogion is more Welsh, and then you've got the Calbraid of Cooley. So you've got these different mythic cycles that are kind of geographically a little distinctive. I don't know like the hard lines on all of that, but we're going to be referring in this guide to kind of all of it a little bit more holistically because this is a practice guide, but please note that it is, as far as the deity entries, based on the Irish tree, which is what we've got completed so far. But if you would like to see more depth on this particular topic and just more variations on the Celtic, we are kind of, I think, leaning towards doing a separate Gaulish one because there are so many things that are kind of distinctive. So that's kind of bridging more into the Etruscan. Linguistically, Gaelic actually has a lot in common with Latin, oddly enough. So I took Latin for 4 years, and then studying Scottish was kind of helped by that in a weird way. You wouldn't really think of them being related, but there are some kind of exchanges there that are interesting.
Well, it's interesting because we were talking, almost debating a little bit earlier about it, of like why I chose to do Gaelic and not to include deities like Cernunnos or Arianrod, who are like really important to modern Celtic pagan practice. And part of the reason is because like there's not always an equivalent in every single one, and I had to decide and arbitrate how much I wanted to fit onto this chart. And if you the more Celtic you add, like I actually gravitate to a lot of the Gaelic stuff because of how much Roman influence there is, and a little bit of like there's some weird chthonic elements to a lot of it that I found interesting. But it's also really mysterious, and we don't know almost anything about any of those deities. We just know like their names and some of their statues and what the Romans conflated them with. And I disagree with almost every single deity they conflated it with. Basically, everyone I think was Apollo. Everyone was either Hermes or Apollo. About the only one I think that got somewhat right is Hermes and Odin to some extent. I think there's a lot of interesting depth to that particular synthesis or syncretism if you try it. But yeah, Celtic has so many obscure deities that the more of those I put out there in this pantheon, the more it would take away from like really fleshed out ones like an Irish, Gaelic, or even Welsh separately, because Welsh and Brythonic would be a really interesting one too. But here's an example actually. I will get to the questions in a second. I think I was just gonna we're just wrapping up a few concepts here. I had it up here. Let me look at Cernunnos here. Cora, here it is. Okay, so this from some of the research I found, Cora, Redhorn, is one of the closest deities in Irish Gaelic to what is probably Cernunnos. Some of the etymology of the word itself. There was a video I was watching. There was a few posts that I was watching that were looking into this, and they found that there was an etymological link with their Cora and Cernunnos, and he's the horned one, and he's kind of a wild god in the trees. He was pushed out by Finn, I think. There's sort of a relationship potentially between Sab or Save, which is Finn's wife, and she's very much like Sylvia in Roman, so like the wild goddess, the that can transform into a doe and all these things. She's very Dionic, like Diana, moony, kind of wild goddess. She's counterpart with Finn, and Sav is supposedly the daughter of this Dergkora wild god, horned god dude, which is very interesting because if you look into the history of Diana, she has a lot of linkage to Pan, actually, in the region that we still call Pannonia, after Pan, because that's when the Greeks were saying, oh, Pan's from up there, way up in the Danube Valley. That's where Pan came from. Now, there's other stuff that says Pan came from Arcadia, which is really just the oldest part of Greece, or one of the oldest parts of Greece, implying that he's very old. Hermes is from the same region. But it's interesting. This is probably the closest link, but like for me to add this into for me to have added that random obscure deity that is only mentioned a few times on the side would have been a bit of a stretch. I would have probably had to call him Cernunnos, and people would be like, where are you getting this connection? So if people have more interest in the Celtic, and it does seem that a good amount of people are interested in those, in that chart here that I made, I could make a few more for like Gaelic, Welsh, maybe even, I'm not sure if I would do Celtiberian separately, but it's very interesting too. I probably would put that with the Gaelic because they're both heavily influenced by Roman and they have all kinds of really obscure stuff going on.
Yeah.
But there's really interesting stuff there for sure.
Anno-Celts are very interesting, but I think like priority wise, for us, definitely the Gaelic itself has some of the most interesting revival efforts in the neo-pagan movement, and I myself am Alsatian, so I think that would be probably the next move as far as like a research tree.
Taters is his name. His name is Taters.
His name is Potato because he is a potato.
Taters. Yes.
Taters.
He's named after the scene in Lord of the Rings. It's the best name, and we also sell potato candles and all those things basically because of him.
Yeah, but I'll give like the intro to the Gumroad Guide, but to answer the other question, snakes basically are a metaphor for the pagans, the witches driving them from Ireland. But there's also kind of that biological. It's difficult to get good information about like the zoological state of the ancient world. One, because the drawings that they did are so, a lot of like the illustrations that we have we've got some from like the medieval period that are very strange, and end up looking more like freaky dinosaur monster fictitious things. And then I like the meme where it says, it's got the different periods of time in archaeology, what they thought dinosaurs looked like, and they show like this weird freaky cockatrice kind of thing at the top that's like the medieval era, and it goes through a few iterations, and then by the end of it, like the feathered raptors that we have now end up looking more like the medieval people were actually right. That shit's hilarious to me. Mm-hmm. But also, like, it's very difficult. Of course, they weren't really doing detailed zoological studies and taking population notes and, going into the river and scooping out the bugs, counting them and stuff. We really kind of don't know, like, when stuff went extinct, when it's those tight of chronological intervals. So it is kind of difficult to know, like, the impact of humans on driving certain specific things extinct. And, of course, like, certain species like wolves and things like that were actually vilified and driven out and like very intentionally eradicated because they posed a safety hazard. Snakes are on kind of a similar level, and it is kind of interesting to see different eradication attempts throughout the world and how people have kind of tried to like put bounties on certain animals or kind of intentionally eradicate them. And one interesting thing about snakes, that's a story that I don't have a citation for. I'm not sure the full legitimacy, but I really enjoy the story nonetheless, which is in India, they put a hit out on cobras and were rewarding people with bounty money for presenting dead cobras. And this went on for a few years, and the numbers weren't going down, and they were like, what's going on? People are turning in tons of these things. And it turned out, that people had started farming them and were just farming great numbers of them and turning them in, and not actually addressing the real cobra problem, because why would you go out and dangerously hunt these things when you can just have this loophole? So it's kind of a be careful what you ask for thing. So the extent to which like snakes as a biological species were maligned and like what their migration was kind of like it's difficult to say, because there definitely have been periods of history where humans tried to intentionally have policies or bring in specific other species to take them out, and we can be quite disruptive. And that's a very interesting topic for the Neolithic discussion too, is always like this issue of the megafauna and like how much overlap was there, how much did human behavior modify the populations, say, of like the mammoths and things like that. And it's just so hard to get good, accurate information about that when you're relying pretty much just on like fossil record and finding artifacts. There's so much overlap in those time intervals. It's very difficult to very precisely date it and get.
Interesting suggestion there, Corey, about the Ice Age preventing snakes from getting up into Ireland. If that, I'm not sure. I will have to look into that. My gut response geographically is it's kind of insane how many animals get up into anything no matter what happened. like snakes, like we have snakes all over North America. Obviously, of course, like we're not an island per se, not a small island like that. So maybe there could be something to that. But in that case, maybe there's not snakes in Newfoundland either, or
I don't know.
You would think there wouldn't be too many snakes in Hokkaido either, maybe the northern island of Japan.
Well, snakes can also swim though, so like
yeah. So
it becomes a question.
I don't know.
Like
I'm actually asking. So here's another thing that people don't know. I try to use as much research as I can. I just try to dig a lot of things together, various sources, very interdisciplinary. I'm not in one source or anything. I use Wikipedia to get like a general view of things, like a general direction of what the general understanding is. Then I might go deeper if I have more questions about it. And I use AI actually quite actively to help me analyze a lot of stuff. Like I just do. It's helpful to sort through information, get sources, and the web is a giant mess. So it helps to have the AI to be like, okay, do you know of any articles or anything that would suggest this, and then I can find a link to it. So like I'm asking the AI right now about that, actually, about how that works. But
yeah, our workflow, like between the two of us, I mean, it definitely helps to have two people working on the same problem and from two different angles, because like we're merging two entire like libraries of like books that we've read and like our personal education and background and stuff. But even with all of that, like it's just kind of so much to slog through and to try to attack it from these interdisciplinary angles. There's kind of a lot of schools that don't talk an awful lot, and E.O. Wilson kind of complains about this, is like the lack of cross-pollination between different disciplines. And there's actually like not a whole lot of the hominid research that's kind of touching mythology at all. Like those have been largely pretty separate. There's not like an anthropological bridge that's really actively, besides like the pagan reconstructionists themselves, like there's not a huge push to try to discern the meaning of some of these ancient behaviors or Neolithic behaviors. That's all kind of touch and go work that we're having to kind of lead through and do. So
I'm just asking right now. So it looks like the preliminary kind of concern is, there's not too much archaeological evidence of snakes in Ireland but like then again, archaeological evidence usually has to be quite old and deposited at a particular time. So like there's no archaeological evidence of snakes or fossils or whatever after the Ice Age. It's like, well, the Ice Age was like yesterday, relatively speaking, in geological terms.
And it's
So I
snake
don't know.
skeletons are ridiculously fragile. They are
Yeah.
very
So
tiny bones, and
that doesn't.
they're
That,
small animals.
what's
Yeah.
that?
Well, like garter snakes are quite small. Like it's
Yeah.
very difficult to. I mean, you have unique. In some ways, like Ireland is particularly ripe for fossils if they were going to be there because of the bog situation. So we have some very complete skeletons, at least of like humans and stuff. When you look at like the bog burials and stuff like that, but for animals to be deposited in just the right way at just the right time to actually have their skeletons preserved, it takes kind of perfect conditions. And with the moisture levels, it rains pretty constantly in the Isles. It's very moist. So, combining like this very fragile skeleton with not ideal conditions with this, span of time that we're trying to put these precise pins in, it's just probably difficult to really dial in.
Yeah. So like we can't necessarily rule out that there were. It's highly likely then that there weren't very many, even if there were. That it was something that came fairly recently. Because of the Ice Age, and so they didn't really get a super huge population. But it could also be that Neolithic people brought them accidentally or intentionally with them to settle Ireland. But there's also a story I had up here, Crom. Crom is a very interesting character. He's very much like Kronos. He's like the Golden King. He's kind of demonized, like he's treated as a kind of Satan to Irish Catholicism, where he was the original pagan ruler of Ireland, and he sacrificed people. And in particular, there was a drought, there was a famine, everything was going to hell in Ireland around the end of the Neolithic, supposedly, or the end of this period, this Fomorian period. And supposedly everyone died, or they all. I think there was some archaeological evidence of a mass grave where it could have been kind of like a Kool-Aid cult, so to speak. Everyone sacrificed themselves to the gods to try to make the weather not be bad, because it was getting very cold, and the climate was no longer conducive to farming. Because there was a whole like idyllic time from like 10,000 BC to around 5,000 or 4,000 BC, where climate in really northern regions like Ireland and Sweden were like super conducive to agriculture, and they were fine, right?
Yeah.
And then in some cases the farming actually ripped the topsoil. Like in Spain, there's evidence that the topsoil was not very deep, and so when some of the first farmers got there, they really quickly got like used it up, and then the climate changed and things got a little drier and not as good, and that kind of ruined it.
Two things really important to keep in mind: the weather has pretty much always sucked there for farming is very challenging to this day, in Britain and the Isles and stuff, and that's kind of why so much colonization happened, is because they had to source food from other places. It's not the most like food secure, self-sufficient place ever on the planet, even in ideal conditions, and that's why. Like in Ireland, species like potatoes had to be brought in that were maybe a little more adapted to how suboptimal the farming conditions can be. And like there's a very heavy reliance also in the Isles, animal husbandry, and that creates its own issues, and culturally has created this kind of codependence and these issues that spread to other places where, of course, kind of the Britannic people have settled. Like if you look at New Zealand, there's kind of a sustainability crisis around the codependence with sheep, which could strip the land very quickly. But sheep are like a very deeply ingrained part of the culture, from this kind of Celtic genealogy. However, like, is that the best food yield? Like, it's not the best trade. The same way that we have trouble with our cow exchange in America is like, for how much you have to feed the cow, what do you get? And if you have really limited landmass, like on an island, and you're having to feed animals, like it's kind of always a losing gambit. You have to be really careful about it. So that's like we were mentioning earlier, it's important to maybe look at how some of these pagan practices tried to create sustainable conditions. So like is herbalism itself necessarily like if the most effective medicine? We can debate that till the end of time. But like for me, as an herbalist, what I think it does is it justifies the cultivation of certain species that we might not necessarily have like a commercial use for, but are nonetheless quintessential in the biodiversity of the environment. You know, when you look at species that are kind of like staple crops for like Wiccan practice, you know, and you look at like the yarrow and the sage and the calendula and all of these things, like some of them are more commercially useful, you know, for medicines and things than others, but like the sum total of the herbal practice and the impetus to replant these things that might not be self-seeding with as much frequency as human intervention has created, that's kind of like the grounds of permaculture practice, right? And like extending permaculture beyond edible food into ritual stuff, like ritual plants, I think is part of that too. Because when you create these meadows, when you source wildflowers, like for you know, pagan ritualistic practice, they use flowers a lot symbolically and, you know, practically. Not all of those flowers are creating fruits though. Like it's not always for like human consumption and food. But if you don't have these pockets of things that attract other pollinators, then you have blights, you have lack of diversity, of monocropping, you have all of these issues. So like when worship of a certain deity is in decline, and they relied a lot on flowers, like if you're looking at Persephone in particular, she's goddess of flowers. But like I have kind of a pet theory, if Josh will indulge me, that Persephone is actually kind of more of a spring rain goddess, that her migration from you know, above ground to the underworld actually follows kind of more the path of the spring rains, and that her descent and captivity in the underworld and the lack of flowers is creating this this myth to encourage humans to invoke and worship her through the planting of flowers, and through that behavior and through like the expansion of meadows and the cultivation of flowers, it's actually having these other agricultural benefits. And I think like her relationship as the flower goddess with her mother Demeter, the grain goddess, is metaphorically like reinforcing those permaculture behaviors, and that loss of that relationship is what ends up causing the famines and the plagues and all of that. So I think that's part of what you see in the Isles, because anytime you have an island, you have this very big limitations on your available arable land. You have to really finely tune the sustainability and potential population load you can keep up with the food production you can do. And I think perhaps some of the Neolithic, chthonic, earth-based gods and goddesses that might have had practices that are more encouraging of like flower planting or pollinating or water catchment or what have you, got lost amidst the more punchy, you know. Josh has pet theories about that too.
The punchies?
The war-oriented, like kind of more Indo-European deities.
Pretty Indo-European, yeah. I mean,
they don't often ask for flowers or nuts and berries, and like so, if their offerings include more like strip mining, those are the results you're gonna get, I think. So like who you're worshiping, I think, does really impact your biosphere.
What is going on here? Why is that? Okay, I lost my wiki article. There we go. What you said about the rain thing reminded me. I think when we talked about that, I was like, linguistically, I was gravitating to this word here, purpuruna, who's it's saying here it's a practice of basically rain dancing, so to speak. But I think purpuruna dodola also represent rain goddesses for like Slavic peoples. And it sounds like pro Serpina, but like not for the same reason, really. But you know, I have somewhat of a distinction between those, but I've actually like the whole. It's one of the big issues or like things about making, because I like to make connections. We all do, you know. But in my research, I have an equal amount that's saying these are distinct, as I do as saying these are very similar, you know. And I'm constantly battling my brain between where the lines are between these deity archetypes, and you know, and it gets complicated. And I've recently, because I'm doing some research right now on the Baltic mythology. I'm actually reading this book. I think a lot of people know this book, A Dance of the Sun Goddess. It's written about Baltic mythology. Um, it says the sun goddess because it's very important in Baltic, Sole, but uh, actually it's talking about all the deities. But it's really interesting in there because there's a few deities like the Laume or the Lauma, which are very similar to the Greek and Basque. Actually, the Basque have Lauma as well. The Greeks and the Basque both had the same kind of deity, but also the Baltic had the same name for this kind of. It's almost a birth midwife, chthonic goddess situation, and she's a bit of a fairy, a bit nefarious, and then helpful and benevolent. It kind of goes back to almost a spiritual, animistic
Do the
perspective.
llama have
But
bestial properties in
yeah,
Baltic, or yeah?
yep, she can transform and stuff. Yeah, she transforms into various animals for sure. And there's a version of her that I kind of distinguish. Um, by the way, this note here on the right, I have Kelly Dawn. You were talking about the Scottish shepherd and Welsh shepherd tradition, and Caledon is the name for the forest. The Caledon forest is the old forest that don't exist anymore in Caledonia or in Scotland, and that might have been the namesake of the Gaels. Is this? It's got a tree connotation. I forget which tree. Um, Caledon, but it might relate to the Cernunnos kind of wild spirit, Sylvanus, that sort of thing. But anyway, I'm talking about Laume. If I get the correction, I have to have so many spellings in order to find things in my database. I get so confused sometimes. I'm like, why wasn't Purpuruna coming up? But yeah, she's a lot of things, and a rain goddess is one of them. In my first glance, there was a distinguishment between Lima, which Lima is both like a goddess and also many different spirits. And there's some things are like that, where like they originate as a spirit, but they sometimes are given a specific story. Or in this case, she's considered to be a lover or a partner of Perkunas, the thunder god, the Thor figure. And she's conflated, in my view, it's conflated, but really they didn't distinguish with the rain and rainbow goddess Veivora, who is also associated with the planet Mercury, and potentially related to the vulva concept in Norse, which is the women, they basically shamanesses who would leave society to be shamans. They're also associated with shrooms, right? That's their particular association. And vulva kind of means rotating or spinning. It has to do with twins. Rotating, spinning, all that has to do with twins and the Geminian kind of Mercurian ideas. And there's a whole... I remember, Corey, you were saying one of your favorite deities in the deck is the one on the front, right? Right there, that's Sophia. And of course it's Sophia, because this is an oracle deck, right? She had to be on the front. And it could have been Mercurius, because Mercurius, like Hermes Trismegistus, is the one who made the tarot cards, who made them, right? So the two of them are Mercurian. There's the masculine and the feminine. And there's one form of education and knowledge and divination, which is kind of intellectual, writing, reading, that sort of way, and the other one is psychedelic, like the Pythia. It's the vulvas, the getting in touch with the story of it, the poetic, right, the musical aspect, the muse, right. That is like the dynamic there between those two things. I thought I would mention that, but Veivora here is really fascinating because this rainbow goddess and rain goddess connotation with this particular Mercurian energy, to me, very much resonates with an archetype across the globe. With deities like in China, you have Nuwa, who is partner of the Hermetic deity. So these are two Hermetic deities. They're literally the twins, representing duality and creation and DNA and all of these creative forces, right? The twins. And she's also associated with, rainbows. Fuxi is the basically, and even in modern kind of synthesis syncretic practices between like Chinese and Western astrology, Fuxi is kind of treated as Thoth Hermes Trismegistus. He's syncretized. That doesn't get out very much, but that's really interesting. Fuxi is very interesting.
I don't know. He's considered to be the father of the I Ching. The
Yeah, he wrote the lurk. He wrote writing. Mm-hmm. So this is a motif that many cultures have, and it's also with the Aztecs, with Ixicatl, who is the person inside Quetzalcoatl with the Aztecs, and the Mayans, they have Kukulkan, who is inside the head of, or he's inside the dragon's mouth, and the dragon is named Cucumatz. So there's a distinguishment between Quetzalcoatl and Ixicatl. These are two entities. Ixicatl is not the same as Quetzalcoatl. Quetzalcoatl is the dragon that is devouring the man, and the man is gaining the wisdom from the dragon by descending into their mouth, by being initiated, right? That motif is everywhere. It's with Cadmus, who slays a dragon, which is anti-serpentine, right, rather than pro-serpentine. The Phoenicians were a Semitic culture, so there's potential that there was some sort of that the Semitic and some Middle Eastern cultures were anti-serpentine to some degree. But yeah, that's a big tangent there, but it's very nonetheless fascinating. Some of the deities in very similar to Ixicatl in Incan and Muisca in the Andes Mountains, these two different cultures would be Viracocha and Bochica, right? So Viracocha is Incan, Bochica is Muisca. These are like the civilizer deities, so to speak, or like the writers, the inventors, I call it the great civilizer. I don't know. It's not a great term. Again, I don't like a civilizer, so to speak. And there's evidence that that white people came in there and they really liked those deities because they're like, oh, we're that guy, And there's controversy about that. People think that it was invented by Europeans. I don't think so. I think that it was probably very similar to Ixicatl. And then they got rid of the serpent stuff and they got rid of all of the actual wisdom, and they said, oh no, it's just a white dude with a beard, right, coming in and telling you all to have civilization, right? But nonetheless, it goes back to an old motif that they themselves had, which is this Fuxi, Mercurius vibe. And his counterpart is, guess what? His partner in the mountains, Viracocha and such, it's Kuchavira, who is a rainbow goddess of the mountains and of peace and love and harmony. And so we have kind of a Vaivora, Sophia type figure, right? And so when we talk about Gnosticism and Hermeticism and all these things that I suppose I practice, I identify with, those are the motifs right there. It's Sophia and Mercury, right? Mercurius. Thanks for letting me have my Mercurian tangent, Callie.
Well, let's address a couple of questions. So,
yeah.
My other support for Persephone being a rain goddess also has to do with the significance of her tears and her crying in particular, and the magical properties of crying,
like a mermaid,
and kind of it's a little bit of kind of a mermaid, but yeah, I think there's other rain goddess deities that the tears or enduring hardship created some sort of fertility. So I think there's kind of a basis for that. And I think just the seasonality of the myth, the whole primavera kind of spring rain vibe also kind of lends itself to that conclusion. Although, in a lot of just like, if you look up the Wikipedia, it's like, oh, flowers, it's like, it's part of it. But I think like the ancients actually had much more sophisticated knowledge of the interconnectedness of things and like the results. And I think they were kind of experimenting with that, messing with that, trying to derive meaning from it. And I think in particular, like the more earth-oriented, chthonic, Neolithic kind of peoples, I think had a better appreciation of that than the people who would come after. And so it is interesting, like the focus that I think people kind of hone in on, to get back to, I guess, the St. Patrick's thing, is like the demonizing and the maligning of the Druids. Is like, oh, they practice all this human sacrifice. Like, there's not a ton of evidence that it was a lot. Like, there's definitely evidence that some happened, but like the over-aggrandizing of that and the obsession with that, I think, is like, it doesn't have a lot of basis, and also it's kind of not productive. And like, pagans do have a really big significance on sacrifice. Like, sacrifice is very important, but I think like the use of that word, it's just very maligned by Christianity. And I've had debates with Christians about this before, about the significance of the word sacrifice to pagans versus the word service to Christians, and the very different meanings like that those have. And so I think like sacrifice in the pagan context does have a lot to do with like an offering or like a behavior. And I think that they had a sense too of like the worship of particular deities being significant or shaping the culture, and like trying to get the results, because like I think their conclusions about like, oh, we've been worshiping these deities, we've been doing these kind of offerings, we've been getting these results, there's still a drought, maybe something needs to change. And I think in extreme circumstances, like, yeah, there might have been some Kool-Aid situations, or human sacrifice might have been a result, but I think that comes kind of after or in spite of a culmination of other sacrifice practices that were kind of tried and not working. And it's really bizarre to me how much we malign it in ancient history when we practice human sacrifice every day. And we still, in America, we practice
sacrifice
slavery
ourselves in every moment and every idea and
not
every
cured.
freedom
We're
that
not
we have.
magically more civilized and better. So like that's just a delusion that we have, and a weird, because like every colonizer and like every conqueror kind of comes in as like, oh, well, look how savage and primitive these people are. They're like sacrificing people. It's terrible. Let's genocide them. It's totally different. Like, no, not different. You're still killing people. If the total goal is to avoid killing people, then there is this elaborate network of sacrificing of other things. And like there's a lot of controversy around like animals sacrifice and stuff like that, and people have very strong feelings about it. And like my opinion in from a permacultural perspective has always been like animal sacrifice in pagan cultures has to do with sacrificare, to make sacred. It's about the recognition of the value of the life of the animal, and by ritualizing it and turning it into this event, by connecting it to certain deities and holidays, you're taking just the regular slaughtering for food, which they were going to do anyway, and we do plenty. We just get to put it in cute little plastic packaging and be kind of like wash our hands of it and have someone in a factory do it far away and be totally disconnected. Whereas indigenous cultures have a very different perspective, where like you need to be very involved, you need to be intimately involved, you need to say a prayer over the body as you're hunting, you need to make a connection with that animal and appreciate the life that you're taking. You need to use every part of that animal, every part, and you need to like make sure you live well in order to honor the sacrifice that they made, and that it's not just something to be taken lightly or taken for granted. So it's tough. I understand sacrifice can be a very like controversial word, but for me as a pagan, like I use it all the time. I use it proudly, because I think like to make sacred means to like acknowledge the to elevate certain activities. And when it comes to things like killing for food, like that's an activity that needs to be elevated in order to make sure it's in the appropriate amounts. Because if you don't do that, then you get factory farming, because there's no ritual. Like if you had to ritualize, you wouldn't do it in that way. And you see that in certain even modern practices like kosher and halal, right? You can have animal husbandry, and then you ritualize the slaughtering practice, right? Because in halal, like, you need to do things like drain all of the blood. Like, there's all of these qualifications to make sure that the meat is clean, and some of them are practical and some of them are ritual. And just by adding a ritual layer and like needing like a rabbi to be involved or whatever, you're adding an opportunity for reverence that kind of naturally lends itself to a certain quantity control that prevents it from becoming unsustainable, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and going back to the kind of Neolithic practices and Druidic practices aligning with that, studying the Minoans and studying the Etruscans, in particular, the motif of my last video on the Voltumna and Vertumnus and Velcanos. This deity is a deity that's associated. He's most, like Attis in particular, is most often like brought up in discussions about, oh, he's the original Jesus, or he's the original like sacrifice resurrection deity, right? People think that's where it came from, but something I kind of mentioned, because I don't like to, I try not to rant in my videos, but every now and then I throw in a little something. I mentioned that I'm sorry, I'm losing train of my thoughts. Don't live stream too much. But I was thinking about how resurrection or the cycles of life is not treated by Abrahamic religions as interesting or sacred, right? It's a linear process. It's not a cyclical understanding that, like, what Voltumna represents is that every year we are reborn. Every year we die and we're reborn. Every year all of our food and everyone is. There's a cycle that we are part of, and we need to recognize that by having rituals and holidays. Like, it's kind of interesting also, on a side note, these days, I remember growing up and Halloween was such a big deal. And people always talk about Christmas, and sure, that was a big deal too. Like, everybody was up in it. That one has not died quite as much, but like Halloween, oh my gosh, it's so empty now. A lot of times people don't even do it. And like Easter, everything, like who's going out and doing eggs? I don't know if I've ever seen any neighbors doing that nowadays. Like, I'm not just saying, oh, let's bring back these old.
I'll tell you what, not at $12 a dozen. It's not. We're doing something else, not eggs.
It's not going to help. But I mean, we don't have. What is unfortunate about that is, like, I think we as a culture are losing track of the cycles. We're losing track of time. And we're just like, wait, what time is it? How long have I been sitting here doing this? And it's like, we don't know what time of year it is, what day it is. Not really. Like, we do, because we work. And we're just like, we know what time of the week it is, but we don't have a bigger sense anymore.
Yeah, like the processing and the preservation of food, which is like kind of equivocated with civilizational control, right? Like, the more you can have your grain in your storehouse and be divorced from the seasons and not dependent on the rain and the time of year and all these things, like, that's kind of considered to be like a bit of a status symbol, or like more civilized, whereas like freshness or like enjoying things in season, doing a harvest and enjoying that food at that time, and celebrating it in its appropriate season, like that's almost savage, right? That's kind of equivocated with, being too humble, too earthy, and it's just really sad, and it's creating all of these problems for us agriculturally, because like, would the industries that we have, it's such an economic thing, our holidays, like, would we even bother to really cultivate turkeys in the quantity that we do if we didn't mass consume them once a year? Like, it affects all of these farming practices so much, when we have these holidays that kind of hinge upon a particular food product or another. And like pumpkins, like, nutritionally speaking, like, we wouldn't really do pumpkins in that quantity if it wasn't for Halloween. But like, what is the importance of that? What is the result of that? And if you look at like Native American farming traditions, and you look at like the Three Sisters cropping, and squash and pumpkins being such an important cover crop and such an important nitrate fixer and all of these things, it's like, is it wasteful? You know, people, there's a lot of debate online too about like, should you throw your pumpkins in the forest? And like all of these things where it's just like, oh, you're messing with the environment and this and that and the other thing. And it's like,
You should probably
I don't
understand
know.
how things work, or how because I mean that's where I'm very interested in paganism, because I come from a scientific kind of background. Like that's an anthropological and a scientific and a geographical background, sociological background too, where it's like
Mhm.
I see that paganism has so much potential to bridge science and religion, right? Science and religion, like that whole thing that people are always kind of do. It's really easy with paganism because these are practices that we can construct and we can create, and rituals that we can do intentionally, willingly, knowingly. You know, there's this question going around nowadays of like whether the ancient Greeks really believed in the gods, and it's like I think they're getting in touch with something of like the point isn't belief. Like we've came to the point is now it's ideological, since Christianity and all these other movements have come about and tries to proselytize this idea. And really it's the same as a cult. Like no, I mean definitionally, like the cults, the Dionysian cult, Eleusinian cult, they would initiate people, right? And that was a kind of proselytism, really. It basically was. But we're currently living in kind of a regime where there's a mass proselytization of a cult, but it doesn't initiate you really. The initiation has gotten worse and worse over time, to the point that you just say that you believe that. You don't show up, you don't do any rituals, you don't even really care or think about it at all, and you're able to get by on that, and you're able to identify as that. It's pretty bizarre, really, from any perspective. But yeah, anyway, we're talking about practices, grounding, like grounding ourselves back in reality and building a way of integrating that into the way we feel about it. You know, we should probably feel something about reality, not just know something about it. And I'm saying that as someone who spends most of the time thinking and researching and knowing, you know, probably not enough feeling, honestly. But, you know, it's hard these days.
I'm gonna
Anyway.
be right back, and then I guess we should dive into the guide itself. Could you do an intro, Josh, on the categories of your family tree and kind of go over that and the archetypes,
Mm-hmm.
I guess, and then we'll into the Celtic guide itself, if that's okay. You want to try to do that?
Sure. I won't be able to show the Celtic guide directly because I haven't set it up to be streamed properly. Because it'll show, So I could show the chart again and work through that. Real quickly, I wanted to say something though that I forgot to mention. Because you're interested in Persephone and those archetypes, and I had some of these up here. Recently, one thing I've been doing is one way to use my deck, Alter Oracle, is to look at the planetary alignments, I think, and some of them might have changed since I published it. They're in the guidebook. But every single planetary alignment between the different deities, because there's 72. That means there's 3 groups of 24, or yeah, 24 times 3. And there's 24 signs. That's cusp signs and core signs in the zodiac. So they all correlate to a core or a cusp sign. So there's 72 total demons, like the 72 demons, the 72 daemons of Pandemonium, of Solomon. That's kind of the reference. That's why that number, it was actually accidental. It just so happened to be 72, which was really interesting. And I was like, oh, this is working. This is a good model. There's that way of looking at it, looking at these symbols up here of, the zodiac alignment when I was doing my categorical research, and I have that in the database. I have them all over the place here with these zodiac and planetary alignments, like Saturnian that's planetary, and then there's all these possible zodiac connections, because I'm not always sure. I'm like, it's a database, it's for organizing it. But for Persephone and Harmonia in particular, another way of looking at it with the planetary relationship between all these deities is there's a triple deity. There's 3 triple deities that is a god or goddess with basically 3 heads or 3 forms, and they usually correlate. Well, they can correlate to various things, and this is one for the Persephone. Yes, and so we talked about in this conversation here Sophia. So that's the goddess of wisdom. It correlates to a lot of things in here with like the Pythia, which in general is like the pro-serpentine oracle, the oracle, the guide, the vulva. There's like Seshat, the scribe of the gods. There's all kinds of motifs there. Sophia, of course, I took that name because it's in modern practice. It's the Gnostic goddess, the primary Gnostic goddess. Yeah, Nemesis, I think you had there too. Harmonia, as we mentioned, Harmonia would be Persephone, Eve. There's a lot to go in there that I'll be doing a video about at some point. Even Hela, potentially, as she is two-faced, as Persephone in a sense is. There's the duality between life and death, between spring and winter, or summer and winter. Harmonia in particular is a Greek goddess. Concordia is her Roman name. And her partner is actually Cadmus, who I talked about being the Ecatal serpentine slayer or integrator in Greek. And so Harmonia therefore correlates to that very same kind of rainbow goddess here that we were talking about. Nemesis, which is one name for her. If you look at a lot of statues of Nemesis, she actually has 2 serpents around her. She resembles a caduceus, which is very interesting. And then Iris is the messenger goddess of the Greeks, who's the feminine messenger goddess, corresponding to Hermes in that way. So I wanted to throw those out there as that's another way to look at some of my research, and I'm still figuring out how to do that right now. Actually, this right here is my database. This is my list I've been working on, because it's always transforming. I'm always researching. There's a few entries that aren't even done yet. I have a name in there and an idea, but not written it yet. So it's always changing and transforming, but those are some of the connections I'm finding right now. That being said, here's the database. Or, sorry, not database. Callie wants me to not look at the database anymore. Irish Pantheon here, Gaelic. You wanted me to do a general layout? Yeah, so I have in here...
I can stream the guide in the Discord just for the benefits of the question stuff in here, but like in the future, it'd be good to get it set up to actually be able to go through the guide too, just because I think it's like more visually, because it's got like the larger pictures and stuff. It might be able to see some more of the details that you're talking about. But yeah, if you could just kind of give the one thing that we're trying to figure out how to focus on or get across is the archetypal categories that Josh has created, and they're color coded in these charts, and that's all very consistent across every pantheon that we do. So when we're doing these kind of synthesis projects, it's like really wanting to get across the archetypal meaning or the things that are in common, the things that have relationships. And so that's hard to get across in a family tree. So that's why the color coding is kind of this extra layer of detail that Josh has. And he also, if you purchase any of the family tree charts, you get 3 different versions. You get a printable black and white version that's kind of optimized for print. You get do you call it a dynasty view?
Dynastic. That's this one. So it's like simplified colors. You got Fomorians and then Fae in general and Tuatha De Danann, right?
Yeah, that shows kind of the invasion phases and chronology.
It doesn't always work well. It worked really well for Norse with there's the frost giants and and then Greek there's Titans and Olympians and whatnot. I didn't do a Greek one yet because everyone has one, but I will do it probably at some point. I'll have to.
At some point. And it'll have some wacky stuff and people will be like, no, it's totally wrong.
It'll be fine. It'll probably be just like everyone else's, but with nice art.
Some of them are quite. There's a lot of people working on the Greek and Roman. It is quite readily available. We try to kind of go with like people's requests and explore ones that there's kind of questions about. We try to be responsive in that way, and also it shows a wide variety. That's why, dipping into Yoruba was really interesting.
Yeah, I have a Yoruba one.
Corners of the
That's
world. Yeah.
really fun. Very unique. So going through these groups, I mean, yeah, like I said, just some of those general categories. It's a bit difficult at times with Irish because Delbaith, for instance, is considered either Fomorian or Tuatha De Danann, and of course when they have kids together as one and the other, then the kids sometimes are considered one or the other because they're both. It's I made decisions based on what I think is the most meaningful distinction between these things, really. So yeah, I have like a first layer here of like kind of older, really seemingly important deities, and then going down the line through the ages. I don't know how else to talk about the structure than that. I have another version here that's the archetypes. So these are general archetypes, earth deities, sky deities. Sometimes it's interesting what's absent because I have this general rule here, but sky deities in Celtic, I got nothing. It's interesting. It's very interesting that I guess one that would be a sky deity technically, although I call it a dawn goddess, and it isn't in here, is Dawn. Her name's Don Dawn, and that's basically Aurora Eos, the dawn goddess. That one is a sky deity, I suppose, but I haven't found too many more.
If you go more towards the Welsh or Scottish or the Gaelic, there's definitely more.
I think Gaelic there is, but
typically not so much.
Yeah, it's interesting. A lot of Gaelic has been, Christianized and even medievalized, so to speak, as in I guess humorized. Like they took the deities and then they kind of crunched their stories into human stories to basically to hide the mythology within something that Christians would be, the priests would be like, okay, it's okay that you have your little stories and whatnot, but you can't have myths, So they reinterpreted it, and that's similar to what Snorri did with Norse in Iceland. And that's why some people are a little skeptical about some of the things that are said in his writing about the gods. For instance, some people wonder if Odin was actually the king of the gods, or if that was just something that was like a Christianized look of it. Who knows? We don't know. There's not too much records of what people actually did in the time. To understand Norse, Tacitus is most of it, and he also, I think, talked a little bit about the Gauls, but a lot of the Gallic stuff was from Caesar, Julius Caesar, and that's he invaded and conquered them, so not the best source.
And strong feelings that were not necessarily in the interest of anthropological accuracy and cultural preservation, let's say. It's kind of hard to preserve and eliminate.
It's hard to preserve something that's not preserved. Yeah. So reconstruction is kind of a necessary thing with modern paganism, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's why for me, in our conversations, the practices is always kind of the tiebreaker, or if you can actually point to particular known offerings, when Josh is looking at some of these conflations, there's kind of linguistic tiebreakers sometimes, but there's also kind of cult or practice tiebreakers that are okay, where is this actually being used? Is this a very prominent deity? Is it someone who's kind of more of an abstract concept or a cosmic concept, or are they a humorized heroic figure? Are they actually a historic king that just they immortalized in this mythological form? So there's lots of filters that every single one of these entries goes through to make it to make the cut, so to speak. But Josh made a couple interesting intentional choices that I want to point out while I'm thinking about it, which are the trinities. Obviously, trinities, the Triskelion, and the concept of a trinity, super crucial for Irish. Very important. Ends up, getting very conflated in the later, Catholic practice. But there are many different triple goddesses in particular. And Josh had actually included a trinity that I have never found important in modern direct practice, but it's kind of interesting that he's taught me a lot about it because I really.
She was just like, who the heck is Feta? or
What are you
Fotla.
talking about?
I'm like, who are you talking
Yeah,
about? Who
so
is this? And I'm like, it's one of the three names of Ireland. So I mean, she's important. Like she may not be super important, but she seems to be important. And she led a host of ferries to meet the Milesians when they were landing on Ireland to invade it. Like she's a freaking ferry badass. Bring an army of fairies. Like I don't know. I'm gonna include that. You know. It's
Well, in practice, though, like we usually conflate that with Maeve, so that was just
well
news to me.
the fairy got the fairy mother, yeah. But well, in this case, it's like you know, Maeve is up here. She's kind of doesn't
Mhm.
have a parentage, so to speak. And maybe it is that yeah, I'm forgetting. I think Ernmas, yeah, is the mother of Feda, Aaron, and Benba. Of course, Aaron won out the name, right? So
Mhm.
Irene, Ireland, right? But these are other two names that were in competition. So yeah, is there
Mhm.
another one that you were?
Yeah, and then your omission of Morgan as a triple
Oh,
goddess. That was
yeah,
interesting because that doesn't really resonate
yeah,
with like the practices I've
Maka
seen. Usually they're
and
quite distinct in the way people practice.
yeah, Maka and Badv are not in the chart because they would be in this row and I couldn't fit them. Like, you know, it comes I did have, I think, at least one of them already in there and I made art for it and I was like, "Uh-oh, I can't quite fit this," and I think I had to strategize. They're referred to as the Morrigans sometimes. So and Bab in particular is like the crow, the red crow war goddess, taking the form of a crow. But it's literally said to be in certain cases Morrigan turning into a crow. So in practice, though, as Kelly tells, there's often a very meaningful distinction between these. They're still within one Trinity goddess, but still there's a meaningful distinguishment and reason to have them. So, yeah, so Morgan and Maha aren't there. Maha is more of the war goddess explicitly, like actually manifested as in the battle itself, kind of
Mhm.
resembling Skatha in a way, who is down here, but distinct.
Mhm.
So, yeah, that's another one that's omitted, but it's not omitted because it is within Morrigan that those two deities are
Yeah,
there. They would all have the
it
same
just
parentage too, like they would just be right next to each other, really.
Well, but conceptually, it was an interesting conversation because, of course, like the most complete and like current, contemporary pagan religion is Hinduism. That's what we have the
Mm-hmm.
most like active embodiment practice for and like the most documentation of. So, in comparing like the Celtic pantheon to Hinduism, this is similar to like how many different emanations of
Mm-hmm.
Kali there are, and how like even if you are a follower of Kali, like you might not necessarily worship each emanation to the same degree or maybe at all, and like you might have different connections or feelings to them, and like there's there's differences and there's similarities, there's this relationship, and it's kind of understood to be all this connected thing, because of course in Hinduism it's like well beyond like the Trinity. There's many gods and goddesses that have just a butt ton of incarnations, and sometimes
Mm-hmm.
they incarnate at the same time and sometimes like
Yeah,
partially.
yeah,
It's a little complicated.
it's all
um
complicated, and there's many
but yeah,
different
I would liken the
perspectives.
Morgan to Kali kind of in that way, where like sometimes even as a practitioner, as someone who is like trying to connect to the goddess, like maybe you know Kali's on the table, but Durga is not. Like, so it's just like a very individualistic thing. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so if anybody has questions about those specifically, I could answer that. Because like out of the kind of contemporary practice, those seem to be ones that people are connecting to a lot. And like, is that because they're particularly relevant at this time? Why is that? Why do people connect more to certain deities within the pantheon than others? Or like, why are they attracted to certain mysteries? And like, why are certain deities so much more fleshed out that they have, like a
Mm-hmm.
triple form? Like, these are all really interesting, pagan questions. But
Mm-hmm. I honestly think a lot of it, and I could be totally wrong, But I think a lot of it might just be that there's not too many portrayals. There's not too many real, like certain deities like Morgan, like Bridget, like Maeve get a lot of press, and I don't think Bowen gets much press, despite being quite important thematically. It's like a river goddess, you know. Some of the older ones, obviously, like Crom is forgotten. He's basically only referred to in a negative fashion. Delbaith, I don't think anyone knows. Like a lot of the older ones are almost always forgotten. And then, like people like Finn, they like Lear. They don't know much. People don't know much about Duin, even though I think he's one of the most interesting kings of the dead that I've heard of, because he lives on this rock, presumably somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean, in the west. He's just under the sea in this rock, and the dead go there to linger, and he's like the darkness. It's just interesting. It's like, that's mysterious.
No, we had that. I mean, he was on the docket. No, he was.
He was in your practice.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, good. I stand corrected.
Yeah.
But you were asking about Bodv as well, the crow god, or usually he's called Ferdoiric, and a lot of people would probably distinguish between the two. I personally don't, because I see Odin there, right, and I see Gwyn from Welsh as well, but yeah. It's complex. Well, it's interesting because Odin actually, in terms of comparative mythology, Odin has a connection not only to the motif of Bodv and the Ferdoiric, so the dark crow messenger god, psychopomp, but also to Finn as the heroic hunter warrior, leader of the Fianna, chasing spirits across the sky, which is the dusk god motif in Indo-European. Like Vilnius, the city of Vilnius in Lithuania, the capital of Lithuania, is named after Vilnius, the deity of basically the Lithuanian Odin, which is interesting. Also has one eye, and he rides his. It's not a chariot. I guess he's just chasing. He might be a horse. I'm not sure exactly. Now I'm forgetting, but he's got his hounds, right? And Finn has two hounds as well, and they're chasing the spirits, which is very interesting. The wild hunt motif, right?
Right.
So, and then if you look at Lugh, one of my favorites. Everyone loves Lucifer. Everyone loves the Luciferian Apollonian stuff, and that's Lugh for sure. And even the name light bringer in a sense, is very fitting.
Well, Lugh is definitely like one of the most important contemporary practice. That's that's why I guess we don't talk about the dusk stuff as much. I think we're light and low right now.
Light and low. The Norse and the heathens, they can do the dusk stuff.
Just reporting.
I mean, I see a relationship between Morgan and Frigga actually in that case. So like and those both are Corvus in our system.
That's why the masculine crow was kind of like when you explained it as like the Maleficent's little crow helper guy, that totally makes sense now. But in practice, I don't know that really came up all that much. Because
it's still cool, but
also there's just so many birds that are significant and like different, in Celtic stuff. Like cranes are very important, but like we don't hear about it a lot. But and mythologically, cranes are pretty important.
Yeah,
so,
is there a crane associated deity, or is it just the crane spirit itself, or just cranes as animals are sacred?
I think that's just like an unknown. I think like they're prevalent enough that it's weird that there isn't a deity that has that association. Because obviously, like, there's a lot of so like the myth of like of Tarvos and creation and like the three cranes in Gaulish.
Yeah.
Very prominent, and like you see Tarvos throughout Irish. Like the cow is very significant. You've got the cattle breed of Cooley myth, and you have like cows being a very spiritual animal and like kind of being associated with several different deities. But cranes kind of didn't. And I think that might just be, a Christianizing kind of problem, where like that just wasn't emphasized or was kind of lost for whatever reason. I think it's probably something more like that. And I think, crows might be a little bit overrepresented for like how much it's actually used. But crows are dope, don't get me wrong. It's just like there were a lot of other significant.
Yeah, the crow motif is another video I need to do entirely dedicating.
Well, to go back and answer the elemental question, kind of, or like the lack of sky deities. So like the explanation for that in Druidic practices is that there's 3 elements. So the like air isn't really regarded as kind of a separate element, and the elements are represented much more as like a verb or like an active thing in Druidic practice. So it's not like air, fire, earth, water. It's the portals or the fire, the well, and the tree, and earth, fire, and water are kind of alchemical living elements rather than kind of the more esoteric practice. So that's an important distinction. And so that kind of also accounts for like the lack of air specific deities and like air kind of being treated separately. And to some extent it's interesting because Chinese wood practices also have a little of that weirdness of the conflation of like fire kind of being the verbal form, whereas air is kind of more of a noun, or it's kind of got like a separate distinction. And in I Ching, of course, there's separate hexagram for wind, and like it has its representation, but when it comes to like deities, sometimes there's this conflation or weirdness, or relationship between fire and air being kind of, and of course in the Chinese 5-element system, you don't have air either, you have metal and wood. So it's just like, well, what that isn't that redundant? That's kind of weird you do that. But it comes from that. It comes from this kind of more verb. And of course, the application in Chinese is more to do with like medicine, exchange of energy and qi and things like that. And so for Druids, it's kind of similar like that. It has more to do with like the action. And so that's why you're seeing kind of a lack of deities devoted to air as an element, but you have a lot of significant air and sky-like symbols, like as a plane, as a realm, but it's not necessarily like super relevant to us because it's not what we're physically actively urbing and dealing with. So there's just a lot more emphasis on fire, water, and earth.
Yeah, and in your guide for so you've got these different categories here. The tree is one category of deities, and then the well, and then the fire, or in a way the hearth almost is a good word too, because that's like a practical use of the fire. Then you have a bunch of holidays right here, which is nice. But yeah, that was kind of I thought that framework was very interesting, of those 3 elements coming together as not just elements themselves, but the things that humans interact with that are archetypal. It's funny because in my work on my Neolithic game, where I'm trying to, it's basically something of like you're running a tribe and you're going through the Neolithic, experimenting with new agricultural and other technological stuff. It's interesting to have on a programming and like video game level of like, okay, wells, that's a basic object in the game. And I've been wanting to develop it in a way where there's certain rituals and traditions and a certain animistic and pagan part of the game that would emerge naturally from having certain wells that are sacred to you or that are used in a certain way. Maybe you can decorate them in a certain way. Because like wells is one thing, and then a hearth is the fire is a very important component of the game, of any game, right? It's like the fireplace, the campfire. It's interesting, that's like a whole other topic, but like thinking philosophically about a video game in creating a world with all the elements that are meaningful and archetypal is very interesting too. But I feel like this is, I get that vibe when I was playing that of like, Neolithic, grounded, real practices have to do with stuff like the hearth, like the well, like the forest or the grove, or the nibaton, as it's called, right, in Celtic in general practice, which is just the name for like the sacred grove or the sacred space of any kind that is devoted to a particular spirit or energy or deity, right? And then trees, of course, very sacred individually.
So, of course, like Celtic culture is probably what springs first to mind for people when they think of Neolithic, because they think of Anemoton, they think of Stonehenge is the most obvious famous example. Stonehenge is a Anemoton, and you can kind of see some of the components. But the organization of the guide in the Fire, the Well, the Tree has to do with Druidic ritual order. And so kind of attacking this problem of like how to make an encyclopedic guide that has a little more meaningful organization than just being like, we'll throw everybody in ABC order, or like, that doesn't mean a whole lot. So I played around with the organization around these concepts, kind of as the active elements and sort of like the planes a little bit, and also like the most connected, interconnected ritual practices and like kinds of offerings and sort of classes a little bit. But it's meant to kind of go hand in hand and be supportive of the archetypal categories that Josh has also. So you might think of it as the earth and fortune and kind of mountain gods being all under this tree category, as like earth as an active verbal form. And then his water, sea, chthonic, and dusk kind of went together under the well. And then in place of like the airy sky, right, we have kind of more the dawn, sun, warmth, hearth, fire, all being kind of a category with also war. So that corresponds a little bit to the color ways that he's got going on, as far as like the reddish and the pink and the orange is fire. I tried to make it as intuitive as possible with the order that we already have going on. And we really do what we can to keep it consistent across all of the different products, so that if you want to go ahead and get a bundle or you want to purchase any one of these files individually, we try to keep it like consistent in our syntax and our colorations. Well, for pose question to you first, since like you've gone through it and we haven't actually like gone through the whole thing and compared notes, because it's kind of an interesting challenge with research of like two people researching the same thing and then like comparing, because like all throughout this process, we've been kind of trading off in weird ways and taking turns transcribing notes, or like this all originally was like a big hellacious spreadsheet that thankfully has upgraded to its Obsidian form with all the nice hyperlinking.
And that spreadsheet was a mess.
Like but back in the beginning, like we were sharing the spreadsheet and trying to like agree about things and spellings, and many arguments were had. So like it's kind of fun, the evolution of this, and like we haven't really played with what this is quite yet. So I guess, Josh, the first thing would be like, were there any things that stuck out to you as like, why this offering for this person, or like what were really the practices, or like why is it like this? Because that was the first time that you were really seeing these things.
That was the first time, when you were making the guide, it was one of the first times I was really seeing what the practices are from a Druidic perspective, because I'm doing this research alongside researching every other pantheon, so like I don't get to be super deep all the time. When I'm making a chart, like when I made this chart, I was really deep into it, and I was like, obviously I had to like be reading on every connection. It's very hard to actually find lineages and make decisions about which ones I choose over others, because they're contested.
The overall practice introduction, I guess, would be that in Druid ritual order, you have a procession, and we would include like sometimes different like songs or chants or things that we've been saying to get in the headspace and the frame of mind of doing a Druid style ritual. And I included the text for some of those in this document for your reference. And so you go through this procession and you go through some kind of cleansing. Usually it's a 3-step cleansing where there's some kind of air type smudging, usually incense. Sometimes, we don't usually use sage. That's not really or a cultural thing. Usually it was more incense or like a resin kind of thing. And then you would use anointed water and, create a little puddle on your forehead, basically. And then you would be stamped with ochre. And ochre is very important because that's like a tree product. It's a tree resin. It's also very prime, in Hinduism you have this. You have many different powders that mean different things, but, Chandan powder. You have like Ash Wednesday. You have, the ash. So this is a very common theme in many spiritual practices, but for druids, that's important. You might not know that. You might not have encountered that before. It's not really talked about a lot. But you go through the cleansing to get in the mind state of mind for the space, and then you open the space. And opening the space is somewhat similar to Wiccan practice, but instead of calling corners, you open these portals. And so you make an offering of water to the tree to open the earth portal in an acknowledgement of the cycle of life and the needs that the tree has to be sustained. You make an offering of silver to the well, and that's a particularly interesting relationship. We just got done watching the Mr. Strange and Mr. Norrell?
Oh, Dr. Norrell and Mr. Strange, I think?
Yeah, weird title, but like the focus is on like British magic and has a lot of like Fae lore stuff. It was very interesting, and they talked about like the King's Roads and the mirrors a lot. And so mirrors are really interesting, right? Because a mirror symbolically is closely related to the function of the pool and the reflective, watery, introspective quality, right? Because if you're looking in a pool, you're looking in a mirror, you're looking into yourself, into your subconscious, and into the water element. So the association of the metal silver with water is really significant in Celtic mythology. So that's kind of an important offering to make, is to take an heirloom, take a coin or a ring or something like that to open the portal of the well. And that has to do with fairy lore and stuff too. And then to the fire, there's lots of different, there's no wrong answer, really. Anything on fire is usually good in pagan practice. Fire good. So it can be incense, resin, liquor, anything that can be safely put on fire, basically. And those portals are open to invite the gods and goddesses and elemental powers into the space. You also make specific, depending on your grove and their traditions, you'll make specific altars for the ancestors, for the shining ones. And depending on the holiday, there may be a specific deity you create a whole altar for to kind of focus on in particular. And you would offer the appropriate kind of tokens that are talked about in this guide. And we also have a guide on offer that's more elementally based, that talks about just the different categories of offerings in different cultures and how they kind of saw the elements and invited those energies into their life. So there's lots of different cool things, in Asian cultures. Paper is associated with air. Lots of really cool things if you want to check out those guides. But for Celtic, offerings are Hobbit-like. They're food, drink, tobacco, the good stuff, right? It's very cut and dry. A lot of European ones are going to be really focused on things like that, so that's a pretty common element. But there are, particularly appropriate offerings for those different altars. Ancestor worship, in particular, liquor is very important because you're aging it, and Grandpa likes it. There's just all these reasons why liquor is particularly significant. So for Celts, that would be whiskey, and wishka is actually the word for just water. It just means water. And it's like the water. Wishka Bea is like the water of life. That's but you don't pour that in the well. You put the silver in the well and you put the liquor in the fire. Very important. Those two don't get mixed. But you also pour one out, ritualistically for your ancestors. Celtic is a very lineage oriented and ancestor, whether they're yours or some, it's just very ancestor focused, similar to Santeria or something like that. So it's very important to make a significant offering to them. And to the shining ones, which is kind of the way neo-pagans refer to the gods, that can be more iconography. It can be more just significant altar pieces that just are relevant to them. Maybe it's a little, a dagger or a spearhead or a figurine or a musical instrument or things like that. It doesn't have to be as much of a food offering as like the other ones do. But it's very important to note right here, very important part of Druidic ritual order that might be different from Wiccan or other ones you're familiar with is an offering to the outsiders. Because there is always this kind of vigilance and understanding in Celtic lore that the fairies are very fucking real and they will mess with you. So you have to give them something. You have to give them something so that they will be distracted and not mess with you. So a custom, at least in my grove, and I think it's pretty consistent across other ones, is that you have a food offering of some sort, usually more naturalistic, like berry seeds, something that wouldn't interrupt, not bread, right? You don't give bread to ducks, things like that. Natural stuff. But you take this and you'd be like, please, fairies, we understand you are very powerful and you will mess with us. We respect you. Please just leave us alone. And then you throw the food in the woods, and you hope they leave you alone. Very important not to forget that part.
Very interesting, because it's very interesting because in a lot of the animistic and shamanic practices, like at the event we just went to, the convocation in Michigan, there was the shamanic practicer from basically really cool. Manchu, Mongolic, North Asian practices. Actually, I have his book right here called Spirit Voices, and he was talking about how they deal with the spirits, and there's like the water spirits, and then the mountain spirits, and they all have their place and time, and the way that they speak to them is very reverent. It's very like that. It's like, please don't mess with me. And the way they think of it is like distracting them. It's not like pleading with them. They don't treat them necessarily like they're above them per se. It's more like we're all in a forest and this is their realm and I'm paying respect to their energy and I don't want to disturb and make them mad so that they come and get me. I'm passing through. It's just respect. It's almost like you're training yourself for respect to actual people. When you're doing that, you're just respectful to the entire world. And that's kind of animism, is like everything is, not to say flattened, I don't think that's the right word, but everyone's on the same level to more degree. Siberia has a lot of that, where the animals are their own tribe, and that's also in Cascadia in the northwest of the United States, which is very closely related genetically as well to the Siberians. They
so Josh,
have similar.
What kind of offerings would they make to those type of spirits?
Yeah, I have notes even about that. I straight up have notes. And actually, when you were saying the metal in the well, that was interesting because they have a lot of practices about the sacredness of water. Like, it's actually considered polluting to use the water for bathroom purposes and stuff like that. And like the river and the lake and stuff, you don't pollute that. And also when you're offering things, like, I do think certain kinds of metal, they will appreciate having that into the water. They like metal. They like shiny things, the spirits. And then, but like, you don't want to do like toxic metals like copper and whatnot necessarily, or,
Yeah, that's why it's only silver, only sterling silver.
Yeah, and I think they don't want, they don't want you to put like herbs in there or something because it's like messy or dirty.
Or oils of
or oils, yeah. So it is very specific. It's like things that are nice, things that look nice and feel nice and would be nice. And then there's a proper place for everything. And like if you wanted to offer to a river spirit with herbs or food, you don't throw that in the water. That's not good. Instead, you would put it next to the water or something. You'd set up a little shrine. So yeah, that's some things. They had special metals actually. He had a list of metals that were like the right metals there's like 7. I don't need to give exactly every one. I know it's in my notes here somewhere. But yeah, they have rules. Very similar rules. And it's interesting because you like see widespread, another thing that maybe isn't always understood from people studying mythology and not practicing or talking to people who practice paganism or practice forms of paganism and shamanism that still exist today in a lot of places, right? Like in Siberia. They don't really, they might emphasize the gods, right? And they're talking about the gods all the time in these big stories and these myths. And it's like, oh, they're praying to the gods. Most of the practices of these people seem to be praying to local spirits and dealing with local spiritual problems, which often has to do with their own ancestors. Like what we in like What we in the West in our ghost videos and whatnot would just call ghosts or haunts. Like they have that going on all the time, but they treat it very seriously, and they're like, okay, this is your ancestor coming here. You didn't properly respect them passing on, or you got to make sure that you're treating this forest nearby right, because the shamans would be investigators. They would come in and be like, all right, I got to do the dirty work. Another interesting thing about it is that shamans you couldn't become one willingly. It was forced upon you. Like you you're just kind of in tune, and it's not great, it's not fun, and you're not merely trying to appease them, so to speak. You're not trying to worship them, the spirits. You're more appeasing them than you are worshiping them. But like in some cases, he really brought this up, and this is something I don't think many people talk about, but like the shamans would have to get clever, and they'd have to get sneaky, and they'd have to try to trick the spirits sometimes. Like that's a skill they had to learn to be deceptive and trick the spirits. They themselves had to be tricksters in order to convince or manipulate the spirits to do something for them, or to stop doing something they don't want them to do. And that's very interesting. It reminds me of that Doctor Strange scene with the Dormammu, how he like keeps replicating, and it's like, how would you annoy a divine infinite being? Probably by annoying them and coming in. It's like, fine, just leave me, please. I don't want an infinite loop. That seemed to me to be very interesting.
Yeah, just that whole animistic idea of like the others, or like these spirits or fairies, like that they matter, they exist, and like what they want affects you is, it's not talked about a whole lot, or it's like kind of talked about in a way that maybe just seems very superstitious. But it's like all of these superstitions are rooted very much to environmental preservation, if you really get down to it. And like that's why I'm asking, like, what were the offerings made? Because there's certain places where like offerings to particular animals is to try to impact the ecosystem or impact their behavior, or impact like it's interesting, the emphasis in different cultures, because like for Celtic it's very earthy, it's very chthonic, so seed spreading is a huge deal. And like there's all of these practices that are kind of like cultivating particular species or divining with natural materials. One of my favorite the Robbie Burns poems is about Halloween, which has actually a lot of really like ancient pagan stuff preserved in it, even though he's kind of a more modern poet.
Semi.
Right. And one of them is the divination of your I guess it's kind of like a cootie catcher a little bit, or like, who has a crush on me. They have a divination method that has to do with nuts, and deciding, who you should marry and be with for the rest of your life. Like fascinating stuff. Like what possible, why? But like the why is because by planting orchards, by doing these things, by like you were talking about with the Voltuna Johnny Appleseed stuff, it's like, it seems to us like, oh, you just littering, or like you're just, but like we in nature act very much as pollinators and kind of almost like birds. Like you have these entire forests that are maintained by like if you look at like the emus or like the cassowaries or birds like that are fruit eating birds, and they poop out the seeds. Like entire forests are dependent on them, their freaky little weird bird dances that they do to breed, their territory ranges, the beef they have with each other about who gets to be where. Like those things all matter a whole lot. So in some ways, like our human activity, our wars, our disputes, our land boundaries, all of those things changing, and then who comes in and what gods they worship and how they do it, and whether it includes throwing seeds around or not, ends up really mattering for the environment. And then, every cycle is like an opportunity to reevaluate and look at like, okay, did we offend a god? And so like it sounds very superstitious, I guess, to like a modern secular point of view, but it's like when a pagan says like, okay, did we offend a god? It's like, oh shit, did we get rid of a religious practice that actually was super important for the environment, and we didn't respect the local river god? Or like, like respecting the local river god is like, the water is polluted, we need to do something actively to fix it. And so like this animistic idea that you need to do certain things or you actively need to fix it, it's very much at odds with the Christian kind of passive, like, oh, just pray about it and God will make it better. Like it's just super not how,
in some ways it's like,
it's like an understanding you have to do the thing.
in some ways, it's like the animistic and the agrarian way of looking at the world is through consent, like actually consent, and it's consensual between everyone, because the dumb way of putting animism is everything's conscious or everything's aware, right? That's like the simple way of putting it. But really, it's just like treating the world you are with consent and being part of an intricate web, an ecological web, and knowing your place in that web and knowing the place of everything in that, and making sure to account for and appreciate everything. Because right now what we did is like, again, the Christian thing is, the Judeo-Christian thing is, this world is yours, conquer it, do whatever you want with it. You know, it's my gift to man to use and abuse this thing.
You want the Dust Bowl? Because this is how we get the Dust Bowl.
Yeah.
Like, absolutely inappropriate. Like,
and
that's,
so,
the soil stripping, that's how that happens. And that's kind of, we talked about the myth of Cain and Abel. And so like, that's very interesting, because like that dichotomy between the agrarian and the shepherding way of life, and like seeing those as so kind of diametrically opposed, you know, that kind of plays out in the Celtic a little bit too, you know, because like there's this tension between like the sheep and the cattle herding versus the sedentary Neolithic permaculture, you know, planting. And we'll get into this in a different video, but you know, there's all these like subterranean structures and like really hardcore eco crunchy kind of ways of living that the ancient Celts actually employed, that we don't know a whole ton about. We're kind of discovering more about, but like that was very much at odds with like a lot of the later invasions and expansions. And so it's interesting, you know, like Josh introduced the I think it's Banba was the internal steward guardian, you know, of like the one who weathers the storms or whatever. And, you know, how she as a goddess is kind of the symbol of like the heart of the Isles persevering despite all of these cycles of invasion. It's just kind of interesting that they have a deity specifically for that, you know, kind of like knowing that there's these waves, you know.
And that's why those are indicative of that like older, potentially Neolithic or even hunter-gatherer connection back there. Is like those protector, they call them sovereignty deities. They can be called tutelary deities, which tutelary refers to tribal, the tribe or the people. Like tuteles or tutatis is the Gaelic German god of tribes. So tutelary means that. These goddesses, they're kind of like the Valkyrie in some ways too. Is the idea of a harem, essentially, or the hore in Greek, is they're the justices of society, or they're the people who hold down and say, okay, hold on, you're going a little too far. Remember the rituals, remember the traditions. The hore is actually the chief innovation I like to think of between hunter-gatherer, so to speak, or between shamanic and animistic and the Neolithic agricultural-agrarian cycle, is calendars, right? The cyclical writing. And what's that you said?
That's where we get the word hours from.
Yes, the hours, right? That's the hore. So these are all the goddesses of the hours, of the times and the cycles. And they're not merely time, they're the seasonal rituals, the practices, the ideas of civilization. Because like all these, you know, you got, let's see the hore here. I'm probably having it in my database here real quick. Associated with Cyprus, which by the way is one of the first islands in the Mediterranean that would have been settled by the Neolithic people in Anatolia and Levant. So that makes perfect sense that they would be from there, because that's the oldest record they would have had of where the calendar came from, and potentially where writing came from, like Linear A that's found in by the Minoans. But anyway, you got Eunomia, who is good laws, right? Good order. Nome is noma, nominal laws. You get Dike, which is, you know, Justitia, the justice goddess. I don't know why I have Tyche here. This is to me, Tyche is distinct from Justitia. So there we go, comma. And then Irene, who's goddess of peace, right? Pax. And then there's a few other ones, potentially Thalo, who's goddess of, I think, growth, reproduction, birth, might relate to Thalassa, the sea goddess. Oxygia is of summer, plants, life, fertility. There's aspects of that might be like Persephone to some degree. Then we got very important one, Fortuna, Copia. Carpo is a Cypriot name. That's actually really interesting because Cupra is the Etruscan goddess of the same. It's very related to Opus and Rhea, the cornucopia, that Capricorn vibe, which, by the way, Callie here, Capricorn, so we didn't talk much about her particular astrological alignment, as mine is with Gemini and Mercury and the Mercurian. Hers is with the Saturnian, the Kronos and Amalthea. Amalthea Fortuna here being one of those. I think Tyche is actually really falls within that particular archetype. Tyche is exactly Fortuna, so in this list, this is more accurate right there. Okay.
Yeah, Corey did actually ask a question earlier about the Chronos stuff.
Oh, really?
Yeah. There we go. Why were Coronos and Chronos separate in the deck?
Oh,
do you want to?
Yeah.
I didn't answer it because, I still totally don't understand your side of it.
Yeah, I actually, I've recently changed his name to Salvorus, and it used to be Sivanos. It used to be a savior god. That was like one of his the terms that I kind of changed it to, more akin to Shiva. When it comes to that archetype, that's one where it's really the difference between the grandfather of time and his youthful form as the god of the harvest and work and labor and the seasons and the calendar, which is both kind of a bit of the Voltuma, but also like a Chronos. It's really, Shiva is young Chronos, right? Basically. So I think in order to capture the vibe of Shiva without making it an old Saturnian, death with the scythe kind of vibe, even though they are the same, right? They are the same, really. More than any other thing, I think, in the deck, that's very aligned. But why distinguish between them? That's one that might be a byproduct of the structure, in a sense. It could be that there's a deity that aligns with Capricorn, of the 3 Capricorn deities that I have in the deck that is missing. I suspect it could possibly be the Mountain Mother, the Mountain Crone, as opposed to the civilized Fortuna city type. Because that's another archetype I saw that's kind of distinguished, is between the Fortune City goddess and the wild mountain goat goddess. And they're the same because they're both cornucopia. They're both the Capricorn. They're both the goat mother. But one's civic and one's wild, and it's very interesting.
She's not a crone, though.
What's that?
She's not a crone, though. The Mountain Mother is definitely
no, it's not necessarily a crone. But when you have deities like Kaylee here, the mountain crone here in Celtic, or Stig, Green Maiden, she's kind of the wild witch of the mountains, of the highlands. Satyr is one of the forms. Satyr, yes. Hagalaz is another one, I think, in Germanic. That's one of the Futharks, actually. It corresponds with her as an archetype associated with winter and the new year, which makes sense. What's the first thing you do when you open the portals?
After you've opened the portals, made your offering to the outsiders, you offer up the meal, or the more substantial offering of the ritual, right? So usually that would be a baked offering, In ancient times, maybe there would have been an animal involved, but what we would usually do is, make a bread like in the form of a cow, and it was really cute.
Yeah.
Usually, like little red hots for eyes or whatever. But the vegan embodiment of the animal or whatever. Or it can just be like a cooked food offering or a cake or something like that. So you make this offering dedicated to the gods and ask that the blessings that they bestow be infused into it. And you would also usually have an offering of water or wine or whatever, right? You have like a food offering and a drink offering. And you would ask that it be blessed. So this is something that the Christians took and ran away with in the form of mass, right? You get your little wafer and your wine and all of that, right? That comes from this, but
totally not sacrificial at all.
The communal quality of it is that like you're offering up this food, and by participating as a community to produce the food and then ask that it be sanctioned and blessed, right? You're making sure that there's reciprocity, and so in the ritual you represent that by this offering. It is blessed, and then you share, right? The redistribution is very important in an agrarian society, in a communal society. So you pass around the bread, everybody gets some, and you offer to all of your community members, your personal blessing, may you never hunger, may you never thirst. And so you share this communal offering meal. And then you do very important divination, and you touch base. You ask if the offering has been well received, if anything else is required, or divination about something else that should be made known. And you invite in, after the space has been sanctified and you conduct the ritual, everyone remains vigilant and reverent, but usually the shaman or the magician of the grove then conducts some form of divination. For our mage was Nordic inspired, so he would read regular Futhark runes instead of like poem or.
You don't do the Ogam. You don't do the Ogam ones.
He was more Norse, so like he was, and so we all learned the Futhark, and we did it that way. It was
I still have to cross-reference and see how similar they are.
Our druid was Hellenic, so like there would sometimes be stuff in there, like we'd have Venus sometimes in addition to Bridget's, so it was like very multicultural that you could still practice that ritual order with multiple pantheons, but you do divination, and that would be the time of reflection of like, oh, actually, if we get a bad reading, like. It's not a bad thing. Like you're getting feedback, and you need to take the criticism seriously and see if there's something that does need to be done differently.
Integrate the shadow.
And so, like,
Integrate the shadow.
Yeah. Yeah. So sometimes, like, something was out of balance or something needed to be attended to, and so you would then express gratitude for the insight and do the closing sentiment in a song and close out the circle, release the portals, release. The ancestors and shining ones, and then thank the outsiders for not fucking with your stuff. Gotta say thank you, right? Have you expressed gratitude? Yeah, very important.
Have you expressed gratitude even once?
Even once. You gotta do it a bunch of times. Actually, we do all the time. But yeah, so that's like the basic ritual orders. Like it's important to always like give the offering first and be open to feedback. And so that's what kind of creates the behavioral reciprocity. And that all different cultures have different ways of doing this. In China, in order to get rid of outsiders, of course, you have fireworks to scare away malevolent spirits or whatever. So it's more of a scaring kind of thing rather than a look bread or whatever,
That's interesting because, they the shaman I was talking to is also talking about how they, in a way, civilization is kind of trying to scare the ghosts out of it. It's become kind of sterile. And there's the spirits are basically banished into the highlands, right? And people, there's a more tendency in secular China now to banish the spirits, remove them, not necessarily integrate them or be okay with the spirits or the ancestors being in the home, but just be like, just get them out, or they're ignored. Right, which is just modernity in general, right? It's interesting. Regardless of how much we believe or don't believe in ghosts, I want to believe, but I'm more skeptical about that sort of stuff. It still is meaningful, and it seems to have an effect because it's like the subconscious of people not integrating nature and their
Right.
family and their heritage and their place in the world and their place in time. I think it manifests in ways that we could call haunting, probably, and paranoia and all these things. You know, it's interesting.
That's what's interesting is about the druid way of doing it. It's like, the outsiders are welcome. It's like, hey, can you just sit on the sideline and like just not mess with what we're doing right now? It's important.
Mm-hmm.
You're welcome to watch, but just please do it over there. Here's some seeds. Which is just a very different dynamic, I think, than like, the scaring. When you do dismiss the spirits, like it's important to give like the welcoming, like outsiders be welcome, but like do it over there, please. Don't bug us. We're doing God stuff right now. And then when you're dismissing them, it's very important also to be respectful. And you go, go now in peace, harming none along the way. Yeah, and so there's these kind of formal addresses that you're kind of supposed to give, and I think that a lot of the fairy lore also has like a real particular way they like to be talked to, or like specific things that you have to say, like in all, like just the riddles, and like I think that's kind of a testament to like acknowledging their nature as kind of airy spirits too, and like just the whole. That's kind of where I think the air elemental thing gets dealt with, as like this is something kind of like outside the sphere of practice. We acknowledge the power of it and that it's happening, surrounding us, but also like it's not really something that we can. The way that we command it is through words, and so like another thing that's really important about druidic practices that writing stuff down is really no. Like written word is really not something the druids were into, and it was like a major difference between like them and the Romans. Was like, I don't know about that, because it's like writing the words down on paper is like dead trees. It's a little morbid, like kind of when you have this culture that's based on trees. So, and also just like this idea of investing too heavily in like books being problematic, because then you're not investing in the oral tradition and the teaching and the memorization and the things that are so important for culture, which super problematic if you invest all of your history and poetry and stuff in like living people and then they get genocided. Super not great. But the heart of it is like you're wanting to invest more in people and tradition rather than proliferate your religion through a written word. And that was like a really important sentiment. So that's, because it's like you were talking about the Gnostic stuff and like the Sophia Logos spoken word magic spell. I think that's also why you see like rhyming being so important in like Irish vocal, singing tradition and like lilting and things like that, and poetry, because it's associated with fairies. It's associated with this kind of magical realm and like being able to use your words, because they talk about like Ogma, the deity of poetry and bardic tradition, he's described as honey-throated, and there's kind of this associated with fairies, insects, butterflies, bees, it's all like up together. Mead is a very sacred substance, and honey in particular, because that's regarded to be like a fairy ambrosia kind of substance, and has air associations, golden air.
It's interesting to think of that fourth element that's left out actually being implicit in not only the spirits being kind of like that, nature-wise, being very mobile and mutable and changeable and kind of confusing and disagreeable in a way too, of like you have to really convince them through really fancy words and poetry to listen to you, because they're like, oh, you sound kind of pretty, this is interesting. It's almost like an algorithm online or something. It's like, oh, I got to say it the right way in order to get the viewers to show up, so to speak, or I put in the right thing for the algorithm to pick up on it. In a way, it almost is like that. You have to play the game, and that's not just from my kind of secular perspective. That's not just in order to like literally invoke them. It's to channel that vibe, that feeling, that belief with everyone else in the room. And like the poetry, like it's same with music. Like you can get into a collective effervescence or a connection between people when you hear music, and it's beautiful, and you get kind of taken away by it. Same thing could go with poetry. It's like you're like in it, you're taken away by it. It's an altered state, right? And that altered state becomes sacred. And that's the general definition in a lot of theory and Jungian psychology about what religion, what the sacred is. It's a sacred, special state of consciousness that can be reached through various means. Music, poetry, psychedelics, there's all kinds of ways to unlock it. It makes a lot of sense. It also makes sense from that Odinic, like the runic Futhark and the Ogam, and this Odinic sort of Thoth Hermes again, that idea that you're the magician. You know, in the tarot, it's the magician who's the creator of the tarot. He generates it. But the divination, the connection between the gods and man is this speech and performance and music and the muses being channeled through people. Like that is where all of spirituality comes from, is really the communication itself, or the attempt to communicate, maybe.
Yeah, and so although we don't see that in the Irish side of the pantheon super specifically, we see it, go more towards the Welsh. You start to bring in like Teotihuacan, Gwydion in particular. Gwydion is like the OG mage, inspiration for Merlin, Inismona, all of these things. The idea of like the Druidic College and the study of magic, and it even being like a school and like the library, like all of that cool weirdness kind of is in that air element a little bit too. And so I guess what I would want us to conclude about like the power of spell and rhyming and memorization in the air element, like that kind of relates to, the other main Welsh one that I refer to a lot, which is Arianrhod, who is the queen of Cara. Arianrhod is the castle in the sky, is this cosmic celestial Milky Way place, and like also the castle of the mind and the calendar and the zodiac. Like she's kind of in charge of the wheel of the year and like the celestial observation of the seasonal nature of life. And so like even though the Celts didn't have a zodiac quite in the same way we look at like the Egyptian or the Greek, they certainly had some totemic beliefs and the whole tree system. Now I don't know how much I really believe, like, do you have a birth tree? I don't know about all that, but as far as the observation of the stars in the celestial realm in this kind of way, I think they really did have a deeply ingrained belief in like rhyming, memorization, and like being able to structure your own mind and having that kind of sovereignty word that we keep coming back to, and like having command of your own history and having knowledge. Because like there's many different classes of druids too. Like druid is just a general term. It comes from the word dwyer, which means oak. So these are like the oak wisdom people, which you could think of as a type of shaman, I guess. But it's more of a discipline. And then there's all these like subclasses or like cross classes of discipline that are like, you can be a poet and a historian. A historian poet is a specific like class, and it's not like a hierarchical ranking as in like one really lords over the other, but like as you kind of get deeper into the practice and kind of pick a specialization, those were really regarded as jobs, and like it was seen as significant enough to the society and the survival that this was kind of, and the emergence of the priestly class, which is a really controversial issue in terms of like the Neolithic people, the agrarian age, division of labor, and like are the lower class being subjugated by this higher priestly class. And there's tons of debate in anthropology about whether the Druids were really like some kind of Brahmanic priestly class that was subjugating the rest of the people. But we find evidence of this Druid college, and the running theory is that this was something that was kind of supported and subsidized, and like taxation was collected to perpetuate these druids to study the stars. And their evidence for this is really romantic and like juicy. Are you ready? So like there's this pile of trash, this giant mountain that was kind of just like thrown out of window. It was kind of like a tallish structure. There was kind of a tower to it. And they just had this mountain of trash. And as the anthropologists were dissecting this mountain of trash, they found beheaded animal remains that suggested that they had been slaughtered off-site and prepared and brought in kind of a catering fashion, right, as you would to a school. When you bring, like, you've got the morning presentation, you've got, like, the bagel spread, it's like that, but different. Yeah, so from this mountain of trash, they've kind of deduced, like, this was a very early attempt at higher education subsidizing, like having an educated class. Like, was that a priestly class that was like imposing religion as a means of control? We really don't know. Like, we don't know.
Because if it's anything like the Brahmins in India or the later traditions that kind of stem from that, then it would be, it's not necessarily that they're ruling everybody, because ultimately it's always the warrior class that ends up ruling everybody. You know, it's the Brahmins are kind of just off doing their research, doing their study, doing what they are doing for the greater good of humanity in some extent. You know, similar to a shaman, that's kind of like they're given a separate class, essentially. Like, okay, you do that. You deal with the spirits. We all live life, but you deal with the spirits. You're the one that has to do that.
Also, for real though, like the Stonehenge rock's super big and stuff and required a lot of pulling. Like it's very. I don't think we can really pin it down just yet exactly like how consensual this division of labor was, how egalitarian the society was, what stage it was really at when Stonehenge was built, and what that was like. Is it like a, you know, slave whippy drag big bricks to the pyramids kind of thing? We really don't know. You know, was everybody just in complete agreement of like, oh no, we need this structure because we need to be able to farm better. Let's all pitch in our 2 cents and, you know, have this socialized Nemeton structure. You know, we don't know. But I like to think it was just something that was prioritized.
Yeah, or something that was, it was...
I mean, we see similar, like, solar structures, like in, you know, like sundials. We see that other places and buildings that are functionally, like, reading times of the year and equinoxes and stuff. We see that in other cultures, but, like, you know...
There's a lot of anthropologists that like to say something I think is very kind of not very smart to say, not very enlightened to say, unfortunately. Being controversial here, not really. I think a lot of people get this. But there's this kind of thing thrown around with anthropologists that, oh, the Neolithic or like farming agrarian societies worked all the time. Or they say this about hunter-gatherers as well. It's like, oh, they worked all the time. Like they were suffering, you know, living, trying to fight for survival every day. Like, even if you watch a show like Survivor Man, and in that case you just got one guy in the wild for like a week, he doesn't have to be working all the damn time. Like, there's a lot of sitting around being bored. A lot of times he gets really lonely, and that's why he doesn't do it for longer than a week, because loneliness is actually the biggest issue with survival, if anything. So if you're in a group and you're able to work together and you're able to provide for your own resources, like, you're going to find stuff to do. Like, you're going to find some meaning to make. And so, like, the idea that it's like, oh, there needs to be some sort of slavery system, there needs to be some sort of structure to force these people to make this Stonehenge. It's like, what do we do, like, when we're playing games like Minecraft or Ark or all these sandbox games that people pour their entire life into just building? And the thing is, building itself is what we enjoy. It's not like even the result isn't really enough for us. A lot of times we're like, okay, what's the next thing? What's the next thing? And so there's this assumption that, oh, if we're making monuments, it's just because some dictators want the monuments and they enslave a bunch of people to make it. Now, maybe that happens in certain cases, but I think in a lot of the cases, it's just a collective effort. It's like...
Well, the people like buried alive and stuff, like, that's not great. We're not saying...
No, like, none of that's good. We don't, you know, what they did.
And like, whether you're burying them with the monument or not, there's still a huge cost of human life on any major construction project. So, you know, just because we don't have the bodies accounted for, it doesn't, and, you know, it's the same here though. Like in America, you know, a lot of these epic major buildings have a huge death toll for, you know, the laborers who were lost. And we just don't talk about it that way, but it is the same as, you know, sacrificing all your wives and animals and putting them in your sarcophagus or whatever. Like, it's the same. It's not different ethically. We just talk about it different and we use different words that are more sterilized. But, you know, ultimately, was that something that society was happy about, or like, were they enjoying a good quality of life despite all of that?
I think it's probably the case that most people enjoyed a good amount of their life when they have control over their life to more extent. I think if you're a small group a smallish group, within the Dunbar numbers, so to speak, at least, you're probably, in control of a good amount of your life, or you're doing what you want to do, and you're working with people that you know and you love and you care about. Like, I'd say it's safe to say, now maybe that's a big assumption, but it's safe to say they probably enjoyed their lives pretty okay,
Yeah.
But that's a whole other discussion about the civilization and modernization and all these other things. But yeah, how do you feel about the topic now? Do you feel like you got to say what you wanted to say about the Druidic practices?
Yeah, I think running through, because like that whole bit we did isn't necessarily discussed in the guide. The guide goes into like way more detail about the specific altars or specific offerings or instances that people can go through on the Gumroad. We've got the link in the chat. I think that's going to be utilizing a lot more going forward, so we have more control over the quality and keeping the prices down.
Yeah, if you want to support us by getting any one of these Pantheon charts, we have more than just Irish. We have a bunch. Go check them out on the Gumroad link in the description. They're also on Etsy, but Etsy has a somewhat of a limit on how many things you can put into a digital file. So if you want really as much as you can get, it's going to be on Gumroad. That's the best way to...
They take LFPs, and we don't love that. So it's much more supportive, actually. We get more of a cut of the money if you purchase through Gumroad, and then it gives additional options for tipping, which of course Etsy doesn't. So we would prefer, as far as like the community development, to center more of the stuff there and to have more of the feedback directed on extending the catalog in that kind of way. Because we want to hear from you guys. We want to hear like what is valuable and helpful, and like what formats are more useful. Because we could just do this all day, but ultimately, like, what's it getting crystallized into? Like, what form does it take that can get through to more people who need it, if they do? I don't know. Maybe that's presumptuous of me that it's valuable at all, but we like to think that maybe we're doing okay on some of these things, and it's nice.
And our Discord that we talk in and that we will be hanging out in regularly, I think on Wednesdays, we're starting to do, what are we calling it again? It's kind of a study hall in a way.
Oh, on Wednesday. So far the schedule is Wednesdays we're going to do like open studio, coffee hour.
We'll just be hanging out in here working.
We'll just be hanging. And the goal is kind of, it originally in our first server was like kind of a group accountability, like we're gonna sit and be good noodles and get some work done that we're supposed to, and just kind of be more like a college campus. It was originally inspired by something like Alexandria, like this idea of an academy or a campus or a place that people are studying and working and being together and trying to create an immersive experience of that. We had a tradition originally where like we wouldn't even show faces. We would all have our cameras on looking at like our coffee mug or our tea mug, and you would it's just so something was kind of animated, so you could just see that people were live and they were there without the pressure of like having to facially perform or anything like that. It was sort of just so you could, it's like Lo-Fi Girl, like the Lo-Fi and Chill library.
It was during COVID, so it was necessary for a lot of people really to.
They didn't have that yet. Back in our day, we just took video of our coffee mugs because that was our idea for some reason, but like it was cute. So it might be kind of more like that. The idea is for it to be more just like a quiet study hour, and then if people do want to break off and talk, obviously in this server we've got a whole weird organization that's supposed to correlate to different areas of Alexandria as a city. We're going to be going way more into detail on that later at different points of like what that is and what it's for. But for now, it's just kind of cheeky and fun.
Yeah, long story short, very short. We use Zodiac as a framework to create factions for organizing our efforts towards like a missions and goals to make the world a better place, right? So my faction is the Mercurian faction. I'm a part of it, right? And yours would be the Saturnian or the Capricorn faction. Mine's, Mercurian Gemini, that is. So it's like a framework. It's just a framework to get started. And no one's really done things like that before. But it's grounded in pagan and Hellenic and these different practices. So yeah,
But in
exactly.
its manifestation, it's turning out to be just kind of like a cheeky, fun Harry Potter house kind of deal.
Yeah,
I don't
everyone loves
know. It's
houses.
just colorful and fun. It doesn't need to be taken that seriously, but
Mm-hmm.
that's where we're at with it right now. So we're going to emulate that a little bit. I think we're going to keep that tradition going on Wednesdays. We did also used to have a tradition on Wednesday of show and tell, of, introduce something that you're working on and get some feedback and like get motivation. Like the whole point of Wednesday is to like check in with where everybody maybe is at and like chat if you want to a little bit, but like just kind of keep the week rolling. And
Mm-hmm.
then Sunday is going to be what we're committing to as our streaming day for Q&A and kind of open office
Mm-hmm.
hours for like asking questions and doing like a jam session.
Yeah, and it
If this
might
was any
change.
fun,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, it's super going to change. But like if this was any fun, just as far as like going through different cultures, do we want to try and have that be the theme of the week? Or do we want to have the subject be a theme? We bounce between like history versus geography versus whatever. It could be any framework, but we
Mm-hmm.
thought we'd try just like a different culture to keep on theme today.
Yeah,
But
sure.
just so the intro to that is we might try it again that way next week if nobody has a better suggestion. We're diving into Baltic because Josh has that cool book. I don't know a whole lot about that pantheon, so we're gonna do a deep dive next week into the Baltic stuff and
Mm-hmm.
present.
Maybe so.
Well, the goal is to have the files ready ahead of the stream. So if you want to purchase them and get your questions ready, we'll be able to answer. That's the idea anyway. No pressure to do that. That's just how we're trying to make it available. So we'll hope to have the files so you can catch us on Sunday and ask the questions. But we'll be hanging out Wednesday just for funsies.
Yeah, and the Wednesday is not a stream. I don't think
No,
it's not a stream.
no.
It's just in the server. So yeah, a link to the server is in the comments for anyone wondering.
Mm.
And then we will place you in your. It'll give you a hat, and you can be placed in your proper house. But anyway, is there anything else to say? I suppose.
Any
I
other
think we're.
questions? I didn't even check.
What's
Sorry to
that?
bounce between. Sorry to bounce between. Um,
Yeah, because you have only one monitor. I have three, and I'm starting to think I might need even more somehow.
Yeah, we'll get it. We'll figure it out. Yeah, Wednesdays were fun.
Okay.
Originally in the Meaning Crisis server, we had 4 days worth of elemental rituals that had different like empowerment themes. Some of them were like meditations or like gratitude exercises because it was kind of like a psychology self-help sort of server was the emphasis.
Mm.
Um, I think show and tell was by far the favorite though because like it's especially during COVID, there just was not a lot of feedback. It was kind of hard to keep motivated for personal projects.
Mm.
So I think that was helpful, and people reported they liked it a lot. We did a shadow work thing on Thursdays in the evening where we would write down things on pieces of paper that were like bad habits or things we were trying to break or work on or whatever things were kind of burning off. And then, we take the paper and put it in a candle or whatever and actually burn it. And then it was like you could talk about it if you wanted to, but you didn't have to vocalize about it if you wanted to keep it to yourself. But just everybody kind of doing that at the same time was really cathartic. You know, I don't know if we'll bring that one back or not. I don't know.
We'll see what people want to do. But
I'm always setting stuff on
of
fire. Josh
course,
is kind of
well, I mean, I like fire. I like setting things on fire. I don't have any issue with that. All right, so thanks everyone for joining us. You can see us next time on Sunday or join the server, hang out on Wednesdays or around. We'll probably just be around. So if you have any more questions, leave them in the comments on this video or any other video. And we said everything else about all the other links. Thanks, everyone.
mm-hmm.
Bye bye. See you next time.
Years.